Hello, and welcome to Select and Start, the podcast about meaningful and memorable video games. I'm your host, Keifer, and every episode I bring on a guest who selects a game that made an impact on their life. I have a very exciting guest with me today. He is a game designer and developer, as well as an educator at the NYU Game Center. It's Jesse Fuchs. Jesse, how are you today?
Good. Glad to be here.
Really grateful to have you here. I'm really excited to talk to you about all manner of games and the specific game that you selected to talk about today. But before I get into any of that, I want the listeners to get to know my guest a little bit. What do you do and what do you like?
I teach at the NYU Game Center, which is a department within the Tisch Department of the Arts. NYU is very complicated and I do not understand it, but there is also more tech-oriented departments outside of Tisch, and we have development classes. If you're a major, you have to learn programming to some extent, et cetera, et cetera. But we are more of a art school design-oriented class, and I tend to teach either a lot of intro to game design, especially during the summer and J term. That is sort of my workhorse. I'm an adjunct, and I've been an adjunct there. I'm one of the senior faculty at this point, but I will always be an adjunct because you shouldn't trust me with meetings. You shouldn't trust me with any of that stuff. And I am happy teaching my classes, especially the summer and J term. I'm teaching a summer intro class right now, and it's nice because it's mostly, there's a few minors who are not able to get into the regular semester, but it's mostly non-majors who just who like games and want to learn about games in kind of a liberal arts context. I teach that, and then I've been lucky enough to also get to teach various goofy electives, such as modern tabletop literacy, which is a 2-credit, a half class, where every week I sort of lead them, from Sid Sackson to Vlada Havadiel, maybe even a little more modern now. Sometimes we have a cutting edge tabletop 2-credit that the great game designer Gil Hova teaches, and he takes, the last decade, and I teach all the older stuff. I teach a traditional card game literacy class, literacy and design. That's actually, in a way, my favorite class to teach. It's the one that I'm kind of trying to pursue turning into something larger, just because it's very efficient. I don't know. You need a deck of cards. They're very good. I like game platforms, and they're the best. So that's my favorite class. But American Computer Games of the 80s, a very specific class, and a 4-credit, a full class, I have taught for 6 or 7 years through a variety of bumbles and lucky happenstances, essentially. It's going to be taken the next year off because we're thinking about kind of how to make it more relevant, because we only have so many elective slots, and there's almost a generational change in terms of familiarity with the material. So it may turn into a games of the 20th century more broadly, and I would then pair up with someone who actually did 90s PC gaming, which being a Mac person, missed. Or turning into a 2-credit and being a much more narrow, I don't let them explore the curriculum. I'm like, these are the 2 games you're looking at today, blah, blah, blah. And and intermediate game design sometimes, which is another kind of survey class. I am well suited for things that hit an idea and then get out. Intro to game design is very much about me showing students a variety of, 20 to 30 minute board games. Here's 4 press your luck games. Now you're going to make a press your luck game. Let's talk about what they having, what you liked and didn't like about them, etc. But for a person who teaches about this stuff, I do lack intestinal fortitude, I think it's fair to say. Like I in the foyer, there's a group of students who are always playing Root, the wonderful game by Cole Worley, who I admire greatly, the tabletop game. And I always make some dad joke about these kids and their long attention spans. And they asked me to join. I'm just like, I really like Root, and I've played enough of it on my iPad to sort of, I can talk about it. I can point students to it if it is pertinent to their interests. But I am a dilettante in a sense, in the literal sense of like, I play things while they delight me, and then when they stop, I wander away because there's always an enormous pile of things I should know something about in order to tell something about to a student, right? Like in the intro to game design class, students do game pitches, and they might pitch any genre, including ones I do not instinctively care about. But, I have a rule that if any student If the game has been brought up at least 3 times by students in like the context of the game pitches or whatever, and it
Mhm.
is on sale, I will buy it and play 2 hours of it, no matter how little it suits me.
Okay.
And I got 2 hours into Doki Doki Literature Club, and I do need to get it's interesting. I get it, and I need to know more, but it is funny having this as your profession you do end up molded by it, and your tastes, are molded by your super ego to some extent.
Certainly. I mean, as somebody who does this to a semi-professional capacity, I'm certainly not a teacher. I certainly do not even make a teacher's far too little salary to even do this thing. But it does certainly change your consumption and it does alter your perception. And you are starting to think of things in an analytical sense, even passively, when you aren't actively preparing to engage with something. For example, this is the first time I have played the Prince of Persia series at all or engaged with it at all, despite me being aware of it and despite me wanting to play the stuff from the Ubisoft series of games forward. But this was the thing that motivated me to play it, and I have, an intense appreciation of what this original game is. But we will get to that shortly. I do have a
Mhm.
couple of questions regarding this whole process with you teaching about games and video games, because this is something that isn't super common, even in academia where people, or undergrad, or in the college sense, even where there are spaces for people to make more exploratory, look further than what a traditional school may offer them. So I wanted to ask you, how did you end up getting into a role where you're able to sort of teach game?
I usually deflect with something incredibly glib when people ask me that,
Hmm.
because I do not quite understand it myself. But
Sure.
I'm actually going to try to figure it out. Uh, Sometimes involving, I thought I was in line for ice cream, or I have naked pictures of Frank Lance, who was the person who hired me.
Okay.
Frank Lance and Eric Zimmerman are the two people who got the Game Center started as a part of, originally they were teaching a game design class at ITP, and they're both incredibly smart. And, I don't know if you've ever played Universal Paperclips.
I have.
Yes, that Frank Lance. That was a game he made while he was the head of the department. And it was basically, in some senses, an attempt for him to teach himself how to program a game, because he was behind Drop 7, and he knew enough programming to be able to talk to programmers and knew what was a sane thing to ask for. But like me, but less so, because he has a sharper brain. He had kind of danced around actually, making a digital game from start to finish. And Eric Zimmerman was the head of Playlab, who made a bunch of real. Diner Dash was a Playlab game, and Arcadia, one of my favorites, as a person who's sometimes a little ADHD. That is you've probably seen a game like this since, because the idea has come around, but there's 4 different games, simple games going on in 4 quadrants, but you have to keep them all going at once, sort of like WarioWare, but 4 at a time. And just really interesting experimental games. He co-wrote the book Rules of Play with Katie Salen, which was and came out in 2004, 2005. Still a textbook people use, although it's a little too thick for a semester. You take excerpts from it because it is still a very deft analysis of game design, but really was the only book in town for a long time. That and The Reader. So these were people I knew of Eric more than Frank, because I had read the Rules of Play and the Rules of Play Reader, and they were just the Game Center, having been started by a donation from a beneficent anonymous donor whose identity I still do not know, was running events. And they were got really interesting people. The philosopher Alex Galloway did one I remember early on, because there's a poster of it every day. I go in and see the exact date, sometime in 2010. And they had extraordinarily good catering, I should point out. The
Hmm.
sandwiches in this period, like 2009, 2011. I had been, up until this point, not in game design professionally, although I did a lot of game design, because I have always loved games. I've always thought more in terms of games than narratives or systems or whatever. And I love traditional playing cards. As I was saying, I was making a lot of games with regular decks of cards. I listened to your Inscription episode, and I was a Magic the Gathering guy.
Hmm.
But really, the first game I made that I would go back to as an adult and be like, yeah, I could play this. This is pretty decent. Is how do you get the like bop the other person non-passive aggressive gin rumminess, but aggressive I am knocking you downness into a game with a regular deck of cards. I made this pirate themed game called Spoon Eye, where you're making columns that equal 21, and they get you to take one of the other person's columns, that kind of snowball loop, and then without really having any terms or whatever, but just instinctively figure it out. Okay, you have to balance that snowball, of when he hit the other guy, he loses a thing that he is building up. And basically all the doodads and exceptions came from balancing that. And it still is like a decent game. But that is entirely Richard Garfield. He was and has been and probably always will be kind of my number one game hero, even though I don't really play a hell of a lot of Magic. I play Hearthstone. It's on my iPad and it's easier. And the thing I love about Garfield is I think he might agree, because and this is a thing I think we will definitely talk about with Prince of Persia, he is a big advocate of sort of evolution versus revolution in games, and recognizing that the revolutionary games often are rough, right? That the second mouse gets the cheese sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think David Bowie said that about Mark Bolan or something, was, what matters isn't who comes first, it's who comes second. And there's some truth to that, where you look at something like Hearthstone digitally versus Magic digitally, and one of these is just built from the ground up, right? For digital, It's much slicker, much a smoother ride. And Garfield himself, when you listen to his podcasts or just hear him talk, like, he is excited about people building on his own stuff. He likes, and he's always making weird and new and interesting games. My interest comes kind of from that. I was a D&D kid from the beginning, blah, blah, blah. Also had an Atari 2600, which we can, maybe get to when we're talking about actual specific video games and the action adventure genre. But yeah, I was basically going to these talks, started talking to these people, had been making a bunch of card games on my own, and had been working on a sort of metagame, a game platform, which was a bag of dice and six-sided dice and plastic poker chips, right? I was trying to come up with kind of what is a cheap, very simple, very whatever, platform that you can do the same variety of stuff with you can do with cards. Because dice on their own, it's not quite enough, It's like you've played a lot of dominoes, I remember you mentioning. And dominoes is interesting, and this is something I talk about in that card game class of, it could be a platform, and there are, like in Texas, there's a trick-taking dominoes game because cards were outlawed, and, you can see the Galapagos Islands evolution of this dominoes being a platform as opposed to kind of a genre of games that are all, like Mahjong is the same, although there's Shanghai, the Solitaire, and etc.
Right. Dominoes is a very flexible game with its own rule sets depending on who you play it with, and then there's also derivatives.
Right.
Using the same, foundation.
But the tiles themselves, they could be a broader platform. They are kind of these dice cards.
Yeah.
But almost all dominoes games are kind of within the genre of dominoes, right? Cards are, I've had, existential questions teaching this card game class of, is it that I love the deck of cards, or I love cheap and accessible game platforms, and they're kind of the only game in town?
Yeah.
In the sense of, trick-taking games are wildly different from rummy games, or wildly different from poker, just contextually, the moods, etc. They're all played with the same thing. And right, there are exceptions to that rule, but right, most dominoes games are sort of in the same key, although there are mechanical variants.
Right. You would say, dominoes is like a level editor, whereas, cards are a medium.
Yes, that is a very, very good analogy, especially given the context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the meta thing was there's these dice and chips, and you're kind of playing tic-tac-toe, but you're picking the mini game. Circle gets the square, like Hollywood squares. But you have to play a mini game, and some are bluffing, some are deduction, some are dexterity, etc. So you're trying to pick one you think you're better at than the other person. And it got into Indiecade as one of the, not one of the big games, but it was in that whole circle. So I got to go there. For that, at the same time, I was doing stuff with Baby Castles. I don't know if that's a familiar name, but a New York indie arcade that was doing events and stuff. And essentially, when they had a pop-up space in Manhattan for 6 months, I was like, I was not in the first circle. I was kind of the second circle of, well-wishers and people who would not just come to the stuff, but would try to come to the meetings and da-da-da. But I was
Mhm.
like the only person they knew who lived in Manhattan because
Right.
in 1997, I moved into a rent-controlled studio apartment on the Upper West Side. And along with being hired by NYU, for incredible strokes of luck in my life that if it turned out there was some secret government program of just like preserving local eccentrics in modest but comfortable means to keep, Manhattan kind of interesting, I'd be shocked but not surprised.
Right.
And yeah, NYU kind of feels like the same way, where I honestly was not qualified in the sense of I had been hired as a consultant a couple of times on tabletop, like friends of friends, whatever. But basically, they needed uh, someone to more work as a TA. They were started. They were not even in a department yet, or they were. There was no major or minor. There was no grad program. It was just some classes. But I guess it was starting as a department. There was a Games 101 class where it was sort of an art history sort of thing where, this genre, action adventure, RPGs, etc. So they brought me in for tabletop, which I was kind of more known for at that point than digital stuff. I got more into digital games partly because working there. But at that point, I was actually kind of in a lull where I had a Wii, but I did not have a Xbox or PS3. I did not know what Mass Effect was. I had to learn that from like, yeah, okay, this is one of these important, whatever. Like I was kind of out of the loop on that side. Essentially, they needed someone to kind of TA that. They needed people, actual game designers would get hired for actual game design jobs and have to like leave. And they'd be like, okay, we need someone to teach intro to game design. And that class is essentially kind of at least project wise, it's tabletop game design for people who probably really ultimately want to make video games. Right. But just that idea of like, if you're teaching directing film, you're probably still starting with black box theater, especially if you've only got 14 weeks or whatever, right? That
Mhm.
that in the summer class I'm doing now, which is even more compressed, 6 weeks, twice a week for 4.5 hours. There's basically 3 group projects. You make a sort of abstract formal game, you make a social kind of party game, you make a thematic, exception space game. They're all rough prototypes, but we don't want to involve development with that, right?
Mhm.
Making a square bounce is hard enough. That's a whole separate class. And then even in intermediate game design, the class, we stick to kind of middleware. With when it works, we do Portal 2 for, a 3D level design thing because it's a it's a bitch, but it's relatively right. You're not learning a language, right?
Right.
It's very nicely designed. On a Mac, it is a problem. You don't please Val. I don't know. Did I answer a question?
I feel like you did. I feel like you gave a good idea of like how you sort of fall into this thing based off like how somewhat of how your mind works with regards to like your proximity to this thing and also like your mind for it, which sort of like leads me to another question. This is a sort of hybrid thing where there is like people have a mind. There is the idea that like people have a mind for certain abilities or like game design as an example, but that's not simply enough to be a savant or even an expert or even like just competent at the thing. You can
Yeah,
have like an intuition for something, and that's certainly something that has sort of helped navigate your life to get into this role to this point. And if that was sufficient, there wouldn't be courses and things of that nature to sort of nurture that. So I guess this is a good opportunity to ask, like, what got you into games, both tabletop and digital, and cards, whatever that would you would
yeah.
consider that to be, and then
Or a tabletop, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, and then what caused you to pursue more in order to be able to do things like create your own card games or design your own games?
I mean, it was definitely essentially always there. I'm born November 74. We get an Atari 2600 Christmas 78. In some way, I'm generationally lucky if like my brain grew about the same rate as the graphic. Like you can kind of be like, yeah, that looks like what a 10-year-old would draw, etc.
You grew up with the medium, yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, right, we had an Atari. I would say adventure is probably the main game that really stands out as just kind of a game that caught my attention and I got really good at. And of course, had the first Easter egg. I read about it in a magazine, essentially, again, kind of in real time when it was revealed. Figured out how to find the little dots, saw developed by Warren Robinette in its weird glow. And I still have like a weird, like, was that a dream kind of memory of it, even though it was obviously a real thing because it's a real thing and I did it. We lived in the suburbs near a really big wood. So I had an oddly bifurcated childhood of like either being a feral child who sometimes got fleas and like a little TV nerd who would watch sitcoms and play Atari and read
the Generation
D&D
X
books.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Including being right a latchkey kid in my whatever, a lot of the Gen X experience. And I had a good time.
Yeah.
I got lucky, and yeah, I got not to go. I actually do have a slide at the beginning of the '80s classroom. Like, okay, here is kind of all the little systems I owned in the '80s. I got a Vectrex in '83 for $50 because it crashed. I got an Atari 800 with disk drive in '84 because it crashed, and you could get one for like $300. And I kind of got that together between birthday and Christmas money and my parents, et cetera, et cetera. My demographic is basically, wavering between upper lower middle class and lower upper middle class, and getting an Atari XL after it has been crushed by Jack Tramiel and Commodore is kind of, getting a Vectrex when the video game market has crashed and picking up a lot of cartridges cheap is the kind of zone I fall in. My dad, our first PC was the Sanyo 555, the only MS-DOS clone slower than the original IBM PC. So a top value at a reasonable price kind of family.
Sure.
But yeah, and then I don't know, an NES, maybe in '87. I remember I had to give away the Vectrex to charity to get the NES. That was fine, and got one on eBay later when they were still reasonable. It all worked out. Then donated it to the Game Center because I live in a studio apartment. But yeah, NES, and then got a Mac Plus for graduating from high school in 1990. And that's like I've been, shackled to the Mac for better or for worse ever since. But that does certainly inflect game playing of like, I don't know, I played NetHack, but I did not really do 90s PC gaming. I did do some console gaming. I was very early on kind of retro gaming just because I was a big thrift shopper when I lived in Denver after college. And like, I just remember getting like an Odyssey 2 with 30 games or whatever for like $20 at the thrift store. It's like, yeah, why not?
Right.
And always being kind of interested in one thing about teaching a class like this is you realize how quickly the culture historicizes itself. Like there's, an article about the first decade of programmable video games in 1981 in this video game magazine that I started the class with. And certainly my interest in the games, well, not exactly academic, was like I liked reading about it when people would publish books. There's a book, Phoenix, that was very fan-ish and amateurish, but had a lot of info and was very early that I remember just reading multiple times to glean what I could.
Okay. So like there's you definitely have like not necessarily a fully developed academic, mind for it. Yeah, but you are somebody who is curious beyond the surface level item. You have an enthusiasm for something and you're trying to nurse that enthusiasm by seeking knowledge of the thing. To that end, what video games you mentioned Warren Robinette's Adventure, which I used as talked about in my intro for my Metroid Dread episode recently. What other games during this period of coming up and putting you on this journey would you say were also foundational to your taste?
I think the main thing I realize is there's certain things you, for whatever reason, pick up as a child, and you're like, dang, I was lucky to run across that. Right. The book Afterman springs to mind of like one of my favorite books, that book with all the animals from 50 million years from now or whatever. And just a book I happened to, someone got me when I was 8 or whatever. And it's like, I could have never encountered that. And that significantly shaped my interest and my way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And I would say electronic arts is the Infocom would be part of this. Like certainly playing games with my dad. Oh, right. We also got a TI-99 for $50 when that got crushed by Jack Tramiel. And that had Tunnels of Doom, which is still a remarkably playable roguelike that I don't think was by someone who ever saw Rogue. And just again, that concept will keep getting independently invented because it is a good move. Like the eyeball, it will just evolve naturally over and over. But we played a lot of Tunnels of Doom together, and we played Infocom games together. So I have a very warm place in my heart for those. And of course, the Infocom is in that class by the lecture that changed the least, because the text adventure lecture is not all Infocom, but they're a very strong spine. They have a very, I don't know if you know the Infocom story, but like it's taught in business school. It is a classic Icarus kind of, arc.
Yeah, I studied business in college, so I'm vaguely aware of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, they basically put all their money on trying to pivot to a business company out of kind of an inferiority complex, and it absolutely destroyed them.
Yeah.
They're a very interesting company, but they also made like really the cutting edge text adventures. On the podcast I guest on regularly, Ken and Rince, every year. I'm on maybe 6 times a year, and we each pick, a game that if we can cajole 3 other people into playing it. And mine are usually 80s games because it's fun to mix it up. They do older games, but often by older they mean like 2015, long enough that we've had time to think about it, but not retro. But we did Trinity, the text adventure, and it had its bumps in terms of the puzzle design, but in terms of the parser, it was an incredibly smooth ride of like it figuring out what you want. It just like, as long as you're staying within its confines, like they were very cutting edge, but oh, right. And then also, when my mom remarried in the late 80s, my stepfather had an Amiga, and that was where I got to encounter bootlegs, like, discs that some guy at work had. So I got to play a lot of like Psygnosis games that I half understood. And that was whereas beforehand, I came by all my games, honestly, mostly in the bargain bin. But to get back to, the most formative would be, Electronic Arts and Broderbund, I think, are really the 2 companies, along with Infocom, who are more narrow, that you can go back to these games and they just understand game design, and they can provide you with lessons, and they are just mostly on a baseline playable in a way that most games, even the most interesting ones that I, teach about in the class, aren't necessarily. Broderbund in specific seem to be essentially the only American company that understands cartooning. And that will certainly tie into Prince of Persia, albeit in a slightly different way than I'm thinking of with the rest of their games.
Right. Broderbund, for younger listeners or listeners who may not be familiar with computer games in general, are the company that published Prince of Persia, which we'll be talking about today, but also games like Myst and the Carmen Sandiego series.
Yep. And Print Shop, which was kind of their best, like it depends on how you qualify Myst, not Myst, Carmen Sandiego. But until Myst, if you consider Carmen Sandiego educational instead of a game, which is not what Broderbund thought, but kind of how it sold.
Yeah.
Their majority of their profits came from non-games from like 85 to 91 or so, Print Shop in Carmen Sandiego. And that was kind of part of their edge. They even had Bank Street Writer, which was like a family-friendly word processor that did very well. Yeah, they were a very interesting company because they're like very smart and kind of wholesome. The president of the company worked 1 day a week on the assembly line, the dignity of labor. They were all pleasant Minnesota Lutherans, and had this, when you read interviews with them, I don't know if you've ever seen Where in North Dakota is Carmen Sandiego, but that was a fairly idealistic project. They did a sort of an experiment of like, can we franchise this in a sense of working with a local educational crew who are enthusiastic about having, and it was not profitable, so they didn't do any more, but apparently there were still like Apple IIs running it as late as 2010 in North Dakota, because like, what else do you got?
Right, it's hyper specific. It's got its use case, but very narrow use case. How many people live in North Dakota to make this? Yeah, to sort of move forward with that, it seems like your relationship with video games is rooted specifically in computer games. What computer or iteration of consoles would you say are your personal favorite?
When I teach the class, I always have to be a little careful about a bias towards the Atari 800 over the Commodore 64, because they're really parallel computers. They're equally good in different, like you can do the compare and contrast. It's like SNES and Genesis, whatever.
Yeah.
But they're that kind of parallel. Although even closer because they're built on the same chip.
Atari does what Comma don't.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
I mean, and I was there wasn't enough of a social scene around it because one thing about computer games, especially in the 80s, is they are subcultural in a way that video games are not. Right? Like Pitfall, one point I always want to make, because I do a week about console games, kind of the rise and fall of specifically American console games. Obviously, Nintendo comes up, but fact is kids know about Nintendo. They mostly have Switches. They have Nintendo Switch Online. Like those games, they actually have access to. And one problem with turning this into a 2-credit class is a lot of the work of this class is just figuring out all the damn emulators, and that is what really justifies it being like a full class in a way. Is like you got to figure out how to make an Amiga, a DOS machine, an early Mac, Apple II, a Commodore, an Atari. I let them, if they can't get one to work, fine, but it's less accessible. When we get to the Ada ARG segment, this game's an exception because Jordan Mechner literally is released it open source. There's a perfectly good version you can play on the web, but
yeah,
that is a point of friction with computer games. But yeah, I would say the Atari 800 is just kind of, it's got a magical palette. It's incredibly, like the Commodore has better sound. It is sort of in tune. It's the one the 8-bit chiptune people like.
yeah.
The Atari warbles and kind of tries to find the note on things, and I find it charming and haunting. Before I was ever on that podcast, Can and Rinse, the first time I was kind of on was they had an old podcast called Sound of Play about music and video games. It's extremely good. I am not a person who has favorite. I don't know. I like the songs in Katamari. Like I'm a oaf. I don't think a lot about this Final Fantasy, whatever. But yeah, I don't think a lot about computer game music. So I picked a lot of things from 80s games, and a lot of them were like the Atari theme to M.U.LE, which is probably my favorite game from that class. I was Ozark Softscape, Danny Button. That game still rips. You need 4 people. There is now actually a very good version of it on itch.io that does an emulation of the Atari 800 version that you can play online or locally or whatever. I had that game when I was 11, and it turns out I was one of 30 or 40,000 people who bought it. So
Mhm.
I feel again very lucky, that really shaped my direction. Those early EA games. I imagine anyone listening to this does not think of Electronic Arts as a font of originality. Occasionally there's a mirror's edge, but
Yeah, I mean, I talked about, again, this is something, again, I talked about in the Metroid Dread intro, where I talked about the origins of adventure and but the friction at Atari
yeah,
was what led to the creation of other companies like Electronic Arts and Activision, which now have this stink of it on it because of
right.
how the industry has gone. But they have to understand they're, you know, there's a reason that they have endured, and it is because there was at one point a commitment to originality in a burgeoning space. Whereas now there's sort of this sense of we need to be the biggest and we need to have a hold on things. And then there's, change in leadership, venture capital, acquisitions, mergers, and that,
Yeah. The name is the same. Atari has gone from good to bad to good to bad to good. Like they're actually now, whoever's in charge of it now is sort of doing reasonable stewardship of the brand, right? But
yeah.
they are not Nolan Bushnell or whatever. It's so distant. But
I mean, more specifically in Electronic Arts' case, it was a former Apple employee who founded the company, Trip Hawkins, and some of the people that he initially hired were former Atari employees, more specifically in that case.
And
Yeah.
Activision, honestly, I feel they're the fourth. Actually, they're a
Mhm.
little behind Electronic Arts, and those two really had a rivalry because they're both doing weird stuff in the '80s. Activision had less of a consistent brand, and sort of Electronic Arts learned a lot from the record industry. A lot of the pull of those is the game itself, but a lot of it is the paratext, as with Infocom. They had very consistent packaging. They would have liner notes about the people who made them that spurred the imagination, etc. Which will lead us to Prince of Persia, because a lot of
Yeah.
my interest in this game is kind of paratextual. When you get to the 90s, out of the 80s, I become a console person. We don't need to, but I have a PS1. I pick up a very cheap Virtual Boy at one point. I
You like the
trade my
losers.
I had a great time. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't need to get into these days. I play a fair amount of VR. I play a lot of mini golf with out of state friends,
Mhm.
which is totally orthogonal to basically everything we're talking about.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I kind of go back and forth. I become a console person in the 90s, more or less, have a Nintendo 64 eventually, and then get really into the tabletop game side in the 2000s, kind of drift off from it, but do end up getting a PS2 because of rhythm games. I, discover whatever that Dance Dance Revolution and iToy and other again, I like VR. I like waving your hands around, and that is kind of my experience with video games in the 2000s is things that make you sing or dance or wave your hands around, and Shadow of the Colossus.
peripheral based gaming, and then also like this groundbreaking trailblazing thing that you can argue like eco comes from like Prince of Persia, like design philosophies, but we'll get to that.
Yes, yeah. It all ties and kind of right, and but also right. I also played kind of like I would get the weird, interesting ones that someone who is in video games would tell me about, but I was much more paying attention to like early Board Game Geek or whatever.
Yeah,
and then and through all this time, just in terms of me staying alive, I was mostly doing LSAT, GMAT, and SAT, either teaching classes or tutoring, which seems semi-relevant because that is it's like teaching someone how to play games, except they have to do it. So it's not a game.
Sure.
But then that's often the trickiest psychological part is the stakes are not the same for me because I never want to go to law school.
Right. If they die in the LSAT, they die in real life.
Well,
yeah.
They change the rules back and forth is part of the problem. But it all depends on the curve.
Yeah. So you mentioned like Katamari and Shadow of the Colossus is like these like graphical, not peripheral based or computer-esque of those things. Of what other games would you say from the 21st century, we'll use that as the metric, would you say are the standouts to you and appeal to your taste specifically?
I remember when Valve started on Mac, they gave away Portal for free.
Okay,
and it was
I remember
this thing where, I would hear about these things, and I had friends who played, I would show them whatever, Settlers of Catan, and they would show me, I forget, Keithor Jensen, famous from, the internet, used to live in New York, and I remember going over to his place, and like 2 years before I got myself a PS2, he showed me Guitaru Man and a few other things. I was like, this is, I can see this. And he also, I remember, showed me Disgaea, which I was like, there's no way I am playing this. But then 20 years later, I tried, good game, interesting. I just had to get acclimated. But yeah, I liked to be aware in the same way that, like, I don't know, I would go to SPX for a bunch of years there. I was friends with a lot of cartoonists. I don't draw, but I love graphic novels. I wrote for the Comic Journal some. I'm not a music expert, but I was Bob Christgau's assistant for a year or two in the mid 2000s. Just again, bumbled into something, and have kept up see him once a year for dinner friendship since then. And I don't know, New York is a nice place to meet your heroes. And I've gotten to sort of dabble as the dilettante thing. I think one thing I hope to convey to students is, a sense of delight in the riches of what's out there.
Sure.
That even if it's not exactly their thing, right? Not to go on a rant about AI and making your own movie where you're the star, blah, blah, blah. But right. And video games have a very interesting relation to that, considering, the open world AAA ideal of kind of, the story where you're in control. There can be a joy in getting out of your comfort zone and just checking things out because they're interesting, which maybe will bring us to Prince of Persia. Do you play a lot of 20th century games or console versus computer?
I've done, this is the second computer specific game I've covered. The first was Phantasmagoria in the 90s. And it's interesting. Like I cover a lot of 90s stuff, but this, and I had this in my notes for later, but this comes out in 89, which if we're going by North American metrics would make it the oldest game I've covered on the show. But if we're going by worldwide, I've done Super Mario Brothers 3, which 98 in Japan to 1990, 88 in Japan, 90 in America. So like this is technically could be considered the oldest game that I've covered on the show. We've covered, like I said, older subjects before, but like not in like a dedicated a full episode to it. So it does make it interesting, right? But I also like want to use that as like an opportunity. It feels like the games that you do mess with feel less about power fantasy and more like, and you can correct me on this or push back against this. It feels Sisyphean what you look for in experiential games, like something that's either like puzzle like in some way, or like you're shouting out Katamari or Shadow of the Colossus, feel like you are overcoming or building something that could easily like turn against you in a way that doesn't feel necessary. Well, I guess in Katamari it could be considered empowering or anti-Sisyphean in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it does feel like you like the more abstract ideas that can be presented through games rather than the traditional like I am accumulating power.
Yeah, I think it's a funny thing where I was certainly at the time the plot of Shadow of the Colossus kind of gripped me. It was kind of, one of the first times. It was not as well Shadow of the Colossus, but and it worked very well on me because I am very squeamish to some extent. Like I have a friend who wants to play a zombie co-op shooter in VR, and it's a good game, and I'm just like, I don't like that combination.
Okay.
Shooting things that humanoid. So, there was something that really did get to me about stabbing this big thing that seems like we could be friends in some other life
Right.
on the top of the head. And so that all worked really well on me. But I think I mainly picked it up just because everyone's telling me it's really good. And like it had this, also, it was minimal, right? Like I liked the idea of it cutting out the fat.
Right.
Of like, there's not mobs, there's not, whatever. This is about triangulation, and then you get to the idea of the boss rush that then comes along.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, the game that, I was hearing people talk about at the Game Center when I first started there in the early 2010s, and then I did finally pick up a PS3 in summer 2013 because of Dark Souls. And that,
Okay.
if I had to pick a game, it's very cliche, but it did bring me, because I had been playing other games and, Uncharted and BioShock were impressive, but they did not work for me in whatever way, especially, the kind of cinematic. And we'll get to that with Prince of Persia. It's amphibious state between cinematic platformer and kind of very rules-based world, right? Without exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
But Dark Souls, for whatever reason, I did go really deep into it, have played it through multiple times, etc. I've played most of the sequels at least once. And it is kind of a board gamey, like it's kind of a medium speed game with a lot of resource management. Like the use of stamina bar for normal attacks does not seem like it should have been revolutionary. But like even Monster Hunter, which was the one kind of complicated game I got into on the Wii, it didn't have that pacing to it, even though in some ways it's slower. And the discovery of that game, the sort of the way it's in conversation with the player, the way it is challenging, but like Inscription kind of wants you to beat it in some ways and does give you many paths, to victory.
It's like if you put a carrot on the boulder. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like it is not a naturally occurring world, but it does seem neutral in some way of like, and this is a thing I would like to get into more. I've played a decent amount of Prey, but was not a PC person, so never got deep into immersive sims, but have played, a fair amount of Breath of the Wild. I am bad at building machines in Tears of the Kingdom, but, it's fun to make a big floppy bridge or whatever. But in theory, I would say the Souls games are a little too statisticky and less physicsy to be really an immersive sim, but it's that same idea of kind of problems, not puzzles, right? That we're going to give you this situation and there's various ways you could attack it, including maybe ones we haven't thought of.
Yeah, pattern recognition is an important thing. Yeah. Yeah, like where an immersive sim is about like overcoming like, these problems based on physics, Souls is very much like it's about pattern recognition, the Souls series.
Yeah. The pleasure I took in figuring out that when I entered a new area, I could have people summon me and explore it risk-free, and just kind of like that this game was, without ever saying anything, just like, if you're altruistic, this isn't that bad because you can just go through the area a bunch, fight the boss a bunch, and then when you actually want to do it, it's fine.
Yeah.
I found that very funny and very sort of secretly. I don't know if you've ever read interviews with Miyazaki, the guy who made it, but the inspiration behind the co-op being like this snowstorm where all the people have to push each other's cars, but they, don't know who the other person is, and it's like this weird, heartwarming tale. And that is the strain underneath those games. I'm not a get good person by any means. And that is why, for instance, as much as I admire and really like Sekiro and don't regret the 10 hours I played it, I didn't feel compelled to finish it because it's a narrower game, right? It is kind of going for a specific skill more.
Sure.
As I said, I might lack some intestinal fortitude because there's always something else on the pile I kind of feel like I should at least spend a few hours with.
Yeah, no. Like the vibe I get from a lot of Miyazaki interviews is like, dude, people complain about vegetables all the time, but broccoli's really good actually. And I really enjoy and it's like you can do a lot with broccoli and it's delicious. And he also just has like this really, fascinating worldview and these tastes that like intersect into this highly specific style of game that is deeply influenced by early game design, specifically like the early adventure games like Legend of Zelda and the early Metroid games, which is like really, it's an interesting thing where like somebody is modernizing and pushing forward early design principles in a way that is less iterative so much just like, well, what made this why did we like the wheel? Why
Right.
did we enjoy the wheel in the first place? And instead of like, examining the rest of the car, it's just like going back to the wheel and creating a new device from it, if that tracks.
No, totally. The appeal of a lot of those early Electronic Arts games like M.U.LE and Archon and to a slightly lesser extent, less successful, very interesting game, Murder on the Zindernoff, like they're explicitly, how would you rethink Monopoly, Clue, and chess from like first principles?
Mhm.
And, they're not all, I think M.U.LE's the most successful of like, you wouldn't even think of Monopoly, but when you hear that, you're like, oh, right. I mean, the dynamics of the one problem with multiplayer computer games at that time is computers just like they're not where are you with your computer? You're not at the dining room table or whatever. So that is another but yeah, M.U.LE ideally is like four people sitting around a table having the dynamic of Monopoly, but with 60 years of design lessons and some real-time elements that are exciting. And yeah, I think Miyazaki, like you brought up broccoli. I don't know if you know, a fun fact is that Brussels sprouts, it isn't just we've gotten older, they actually have been genetically engineered to be much less bitter over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Like
Same
they
thing.
cracked
We've
it.
genetically modified jalapenos too
Yeah.
to be less spicy.
So that, yeah, I think, well, I don't know if that's necessarily a positive, but I do think the Brussels sprout, I don't know. I'll have to go back to a jalapeno. But yeah, Miyazaki as the Brussels sprout, right? Taking the Brussels sprouts of the 80s, like the hard game that is just brutal. Prince of Persia has some of this if you're not save scumming. It mitigates it to some extent, but I think is still kind of masso core by today's standards.
Mhm.
The time limit. We'll get to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that guy a lot. I would like to see, I think he is probably one of the greatest managers of all time. Like just Elden Ring. I played it for 30 or 40 hours. I liked it a lot, but once I stopped finding things that I could do pretty easily, I was like, it didn't draw me totally in. It's an extremely good game, obviously. It did incredibly well, and
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
I just get a sense that he can manage a AAA size team. He is like a preternaturally sane person, is the sense I get, right? And that
Yeah.
in and of itself is its skill. I would like to see his next game be like they reboot The Adventures of Cookies and Cream or just some absolutely different tone, because I did enjoy his VR game. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was a very good exclusive. It was all the spooky children from a Souls game in
Yeah.
in a child thing, and you're going around and doing point and click stuff. But again, in that way, same with Shadow of the Colossus, I'm not sure I 100% like what I tend to vibe with aesthetically is probably cartoonier, but they're incredibly good. Like,
Yeah.
I would say the same about, I don't know, Pink Floyd. Like, it's not exactly my thing, but like, yeah, they're Pink Floyd.
Yeah. It's progressive rock. It's progressing.
It's
I don't
grand,
know.
right? And I do tend to be kind of pop, a little more on the maybe XTC side of the art, like the little 3-minute package.
I love both. I love XTC and I love Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Time and place, right? It was Durancy, I think, is the name of the Miyazaki VR game.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was quite good. And it is a game that, like, it's a whatever 5 to 8 hour aperitif. But right, the Souls games stand out just because I do not tend to play. I was listening to your podcast with Peter from 5.4 about Horizon Zero Dawn, and like I'm like I want to focus that much on one game because that game actually sounds like it is of literary merit in a way that you get through playing that kind of large open world game.
Yeah. It's an interesting medium because, a book, and there's certainly your House of Leaves with books, right?
Right.
But like primarily a book's purpose is to like convey a story to you or to deliver information unto you. People turn books into games through the tabletop medium, and then that sort of becomes its own derivative of text. And text also becomes like the initial parts of video games. But then as tabletop finds itself evolving into being more about the personable experience and like the layouts and like the decoration,
Mhm.
the pieces of a thing, and how video games become a lot more graphical, they begin to like, become so radically different from its text, originator.
Yeah, yeah.
The ways like, video games can be like these things that convey traditional narrative, like the way a book could, even as it's become more graphical. There's also like this space where it is like this can be pure game, your Balatros or things like that. It is interesting, and that's like the thing that's been very exciting to me about doing this podcast. Is like I would say Horizon Zero Dawn is probably one of the more traditionally video game AAA things I've covered on the show. And like you said, it is of literary merit in terms of how it is able to deliver a narrative experience into somebody. But it is also like there's also different vectors through which narrative is conveyed, whether that's like the RPG mechanics of a Final Fantasy or something through Shadow of the Colossus where there is no English language speaking and everything is purely experiential through the actual core emotions are experienced through gameplay rather than through the momentary cutscenes. So it is
Yeah.
that's what's so interesting to me about this, and I'm glad that is something that's made you curious to like step outside your comfort zone just listening to us talk about that.
Yeah, I think ultimately that there is this more abstract thing that drives me that cuts across genre that gets me to at least dabble with games that are kind of outside my usual, which is that idea of like, right, mechanics as metaphor to, this is something that intro to game design class focuses on very closely of just like, what does this mechanic mean? Right. And we even do exercises where I'll take like Dominion cards or Marvel Snap or something they've played and, separate the card from the power and be like, can we match these up? Do these make sense? What is this trying to express about this character or this archetype or whatever? And yeah, I mean, I think all of Shadow of the Colossus is a completely coherent package. It's a masterpiece in the traditional sense of just like it proves that guy's a master.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it definitely stepping outside your comfort zone. My old boss at the Game Center, who I talked about, Frank Lance, the new director is Naomi Clark, who's another fantastic game designer. But Frank recently wrote a book called The Beauty of Games. That's kind of a summary of talks he has given at GDC and et cetera, et cetera. But, putting it all together, smoothing it out, highly recommended, really good book. And his basic theory, which I think is absolutely true, albeit partial, is the beauty of games is kind of their experiments you do on your own brain where you kind of learn things about how you react to things, that it is the art of, like painting is about how you see, games are about how you do or whatever. Right. And yeah, and again, that gets back to often I do like a Sisyphean loop game, which is sort of just like Balatro, which you mentioned, Slay the Spire, roguelike Dream Quest, even before that. That's another kind of obscurity that if you were a board game person, people are like, oh, someone made a Dominion game as a roguelike. It's weird. They're weird ones because the passion that you can have for something like Horizon Zero Dawn's a little different because they're a lifestyle. A lot of what I do is I play them if I'm on listening to a podcast. Not on. I promise I'm giving you my full attention. I can now play Slay the Spire vertically on my fairly small phone while holding a pole on the subway, wearing a mask and listening to someone talk about something and like moving the card sideways just because I'm so used to it. And, it occupies a certain portion of my brain. The story of it, right? It doesn't have that same impact that something, as you said, of literary merit. All games are good, or most games. All games are trying.
I love video games. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But let's narrow our focus here and focus on the subject of today's episode.
Yeah.
The game that you selected for today's discussion, 1989's Prince of Persia. Prince of Persia is a 1989 cinematic platformer game that was published by Broderbund, an American software company known for publishing Apple II video games like Choplifter, Loderunner, Karateka, as well as other major computer games such as Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, Myst, and the Carmen Sandiego series. The game was programmed and designed by Jordan Mechner for the Apple II. Mechner used rotoscoping, the animation technique in which live-action footage is used to animate movement, in order to animate the game's sprites. Mechner traced over footage of his younger brother running and jumping in order to animate the platforming of the game. The final duel between Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone in The Adventures of Robin Hood was also rotoscoped to create the combat sprites. This quote from Mechner best describes his process. Quote, "When we made that decision with Prince of Persia, I wasn't thinking about being cutting edge. We did it essentially because I'm not that good at drawing or animation, and it was the only way I could think of to get lifelike movement." This is to sort of like describe that Mechner's pretty young. I think he's fresh out of college when he's designing this game, and he is not really thinking of art design, which you guys talked about in your Kane and Lynch episode on Prince of Persia with regards to how they're using rotoscoping. It's not really in service of creating like this new graphically demanding art style so much as him being like, I'm using this as the closest version I have to a shortcut. I'm working with my own limitations and using rotoscoping to work around that. And all art is a struggle against limitation. I've said as much before. And it's interesting to see this represented in the early graphical computer game, relatively early. Like we've had plenty of games with graphics. It's 1989. It's not 1980, but it is still like, it's just interesting to see that design principle.
I actually think he is being overly modest there and self-effacing, because he did want to be a cartoonist until he was like 13 and got an Apple II. And he has done his graphic memoir, which is quite good. And, he's a perfectly talented cartoonist. He is being partly modest, but also feels like he can't figure out how to apply animation principles that he probably knows to some extent, because he is very interested in movies. He's interested in silent movies. He's interested in movement and animation. I think he knows what he doesn't know. There is an interesting thing when you look at American video games versus Japanese video games. Of when I was growing up, I didn't really separate them in the arcade because Atari is a Japanese name. They're an American company, so that's confusing enough. They would also license, Dig Dug from Namco, so it would have Ataris, whatever, Midway, Pac-Man. So you didn't really separate them. But as I started teaching this class, it became very clear that Japanese games kind of absorbed the principles of cartooning in a way that American games just did not.
Sure.
Like the arcade games that look good are color vector, like Tempest or Robotron or Defender, which are beautiful in their own way, or Centipede, but not cartoon. There's no squash and bounce. There's no even the level of sort of character where you can have a little cutscene of Pac-Man, right?
Yeah.
Whereas even a, so-so Japanese game like Mappy, not a great game, but a fine game, and is very bouncy and cartoony, and kind of you can see principles of animation at work. When you look at American computer games, one thing I mentioned earlier is my favorite week is educational games, because those are still kind of fun in general, because they have good UI, because children had to use that. Like someone thought this through, and they're interesting, and you can kind of dabble with them pretty easily. But aside from a few children's games, it's really Broderbund, like Carmen Sandiego. Some of their other action games, like Spare Change, is a very minor game, but one students often do end up playing, because it's just got it's kind of an arcade game, but adapted to computer. It's got a wild array of difficulty settings, very granular, very forward-thinking accessibility stuff. But it's just got a cartoony bounciness you just don't see in most of these. And yeah, I think Mechner recognized that and just was like, I'm going to try rotoscoping because it's fascinating. I've watched Cab Calloway, as many of the Moocher, turn into a ghost, and let's see how that goes here.
Yeah. Thank you for that added context. I think that really qualifies this part of it helps me lay back and be like, okay, I'm in good hands in this episode. Awesome. Great. Which of course you are an educator, so appreciate it. Tommy Pierce, a close friend and colleague of Mechner's, was a tremendous influence on this game's development. Though she did not work on the game in an official capacity, her feedback helped to shape the game into what it was. Her finding the gameplay dull initially was what ultimately added combat to the game, and her request for more variety despite the limited memory of the Apple II was what led to the inspiration of creating the Shadow Man, a doppelganger of the Prince character. We'll get into that shortly. Even games programmed and designed by one person, such as Jordan Mechner, often take feedback and inspiration from other people. It's a very core part of the process. This is why video games do QAing and things like that to this day, But even on a micro level, to understand on a foundational level, we're always taking inspiration from other people. And it is a very important part of the creative process, even if somebody's not working in an official capacity, to take in the world around you and also feedback from people that you care about. And I think that that is a very important part of the creative process, as stated just 20 seconds ago. Francis Mechner, Jordan's father, served as the game's composer, so he certainly kept it in the family in terms of having his brother serve as the primary rotoscoping influence, and then his father helping to compose the game's score. And here is the plot of the game as described from its original manual, word for word. It is a time of darkness. While the Sultan is off fighting a foreign war, his Grand Vizier, Jafar, has seized the reins of power. Throughout the land, the people groan under the yoke of tyranny and dream of better days. You are the only obstacle between Jafar and the throne. An adventurer from a foreign land, innocent of palace intrigues, you have won the heart of the Sultan's lovely young daughter. And in so doing, you have unwittingly made a powerful enemy. On Jafar's orders, you are arrested, stripped of your sword and possessions, and thrown into the Sultan's dungeons. As for the princess, Jafar gives her a choice, and an hour to decide. Marry him, or die. Locked in a room high in the palace tower, the princess rests all her hopes on you. For when the last sands drain from the hourglass, her choice can bring only a throne for the Grand Vizier, a new reign of terror for his long-suffering subjects, and death for the brave youth who might have been Prince of Persia. Shenanigans ensue. That last part was me editorializing. As for the gameplay, you have 1 real-time hour to go through 12 levels in this fortress to save the princess from Jafar. That's right, 1 real-time hour that the game is constantly calculating. Along the way, you must deal with variations of 3 obstacles: spike traps, deep pits, and slicers that are kind of guillotine-y with teeth. Each time you die, you restart to the beginning of the level, but as stated previously, the timer never stops or resets. If you do not get to Jafar before the hour runs out, the princess will be gone, initiating a game over and forcing you to start again from level 1. The game is a 2D experience. It is not a side scroller because the sides do not scroll. You go from screen to screen in order to scale this fortress. Once you are scaling to another floor, another level begins, and you start the next level. Along the way, you also initiate combat against the enemies that you run into, primarily guards. So it's variations of a handful of things, but it does get a lot of mileage out of those variations.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of fascinating things about this game. I would say there's 2 main fascinating things, which are A, it is a genuinely fascinating game in and of itself, and B, the author of the game has written more about it and more eloquently than any other game from the period I know.
Yeah.
I need to read the John Romero memoir, which sounds great. But Mechner has written, has published, he has kept he's gone back and cleaned up the editing, whatever, but I suspect he was just a very good writer from a pretty early age.
Yeah.
Kept a diary as early as like 81 or 82 for Karateka, published the Karateka one and the Prince of Persia one as PDFs on his website. Unfortunately, the print published hardcover, which is lovely and adds drawings and stuff, is out of print right now, but I'm sure it'll come back. He gave a GDC postmortem. He's given talks. He gave a talk at the Game Center. It is a well-covered game, and certainly when you're teaching a class, it is very helpful to kind of have this richness to it, but also like he was a little older than my students, but and the incredibly, I don't want to say Charlie Brownish, but it is not a smooth ride from beginning to end. And it's always kind of interesting when the end of the story is a happy ending because you've heard of this game and it was successful ultimately. But like Prince of Persia is a failure for the first year it comes out. And we can get to that. It is fascinating for a variety of reasons, but one way to think of it is as a insanely ambitious Apple II 8-bit game that then basically passes into history as a nice, tight little 16-bit game.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because this game is Mechner being ambivalent about games. Like you read his diary, he's like, is this market going to crash? Certainly the Apple II is insanely old by this point, right? Even when he starts this in 85, it is wildly outclassed by the Atari, the Commodore. The Mac has already come out. His Prince of Persia diary starts with him getting a Mac that he's then using for like writing letters to his mom. Like that is his actual computer he just does stuff with. But he's also very interested in becoming a screenwriter. He has written a screenplay called Burstone. He loves Chris Columbus. He is shopping it around to some, at some point in his diary, he quotes the Pauline Kael, Hollywood is the only town where you can die of success or die of promise, whatever. Like, just like he keeps getting like, oh, this is going to work type encouragement. It never goes anywhere.
Yeah, he's a person who's like, even if you look at his history, like read it passively without reading these journals, he just comes across as a person who wants to do so much more than like what, like he's a person who wants to be in movies. He wants to write. He wants to like publish. Like there's clearly a lot rattling around in his head as a person, which I admire.
Yeah. No, he is when you meet him, he came again when he did the recent graphic memoir. He wanted to call it a novel. It's all true. To NYU. And yeah, I mean, he's a remarkable presence. Like he has an energy to him as a man approaching 60, where it's like he's vibrant. You go back, right? But he is also charmingly wishy-washy in that he keeps, even when he was making Karateka, he is like going back and forth. His previous game that never gets published is Death Bounce, which is kind of a slick asteroids riff. He didn't decide if he regrets whether not getting it published or not doing the final stuff Broderbund wanted him to do to it, so he's cavilling over that while he's making Karateka, which is a big hit, which is number one on the briefly existing Billboard computer software charts. But he is not happy about that because it's 1985 and the computer games market has kind of crashed. So compared to like Choplifter, he's really sold like a tenth the copies that that did. The other big Broderbund game hit, and then that ends up being a big hit on Nintendo. It is a very charmingly human path where this game ends up taking 4 years, but really is like 2 years and then 2 years of not, there's a lot of like, I looked at the code, it's been 8 months. I have no idea what any of this means.
Yeah, I think like it's very important context to understand that he is a person that is kind of struggling with himself, but also like really using that kind of struggle as like this really strong creative ember, as like indicated in his writings. It is a very artisty thing to do, to just be constantly like, oh my God, am I even good at what I do? And then persevere anyway, because like, what else are you going to do? One, it keeps the lights on. Two, it's like, this is all I kind of know how to do. I don't think he's torturous or anything like that, but I think he is a kind of person who is like full of ideas, but sees through everything, despite the fact that like, he doesn't know how this is going to look on the other side of it.
I mean, the part that especially fascinates me in the context of the 80s class and just looking at this stuff, and one thing that is a general thread of things I maybe spend a little too much time on in class, are like the really great Twilight games in a system where it's like, it's clear this system's dying. Or this company, like a lot of like Trinity, that Infocom game we covered is one of their best games, comes out when it's clear Infocom is a dead man walking, at least internally. And Prince of Persia, what fascinates me is because of his ambivalence, he is not willing to relearn an entire new, assembly language on a Mac or whatever, right? He started on the Apple II when it was like 13 or 14. He knows this backwards and forwards. If you're unsure about yourself creatively as a cartoonist, it is not as though your pen is about to go obsolete. Like there is this weird pressure where he is realizing this is slipping away. And in fact, as I said, when the Apple II version comes out and they don't really have conversions ready until next year, it's a total like it is selling as well as Karateka is still selling from 4 or 5 years ago. It sells, I think, 9,000 copies in its first 6 months or something. Yeah. And he is basically like, well, time for, film school, or at least hanging out with film school students in New York and working as a gaffer on students' movies. So they owe me favors and all sort of, etc. The DOS version, other things happen at Broderbund. The DOS version comes out, the Super Nintendo version comes out, and all of a sudden Prince of Persia is a thing people have heard of.
Yeah. Like stated earlier, if we go purely off of North American release dates, the original Prince of Persia is the oldest game I've covered on the show to date. Super Mario Bros. 3, which I previously covered with Dre from Fine Time, also a Twilight Years game on its console, the Nintendo Entertainment System. That was released in 1990 in North America, but was originally released for the Famicom in Japan in October of 1988. Prince of Persia was originally released for the Apple II on October 3rd of 1989. And I want to qualify this because I have a sense of you saying it. When Mario 3 comes out on the NES, there's still no Super Nintendo, but like when the Apple II, this game comes out on the Apple II, there is a Mac in his house and he is using it.
And so, there's the Amiga with its beautiful whatever. And
yeah. talking about some other games released in 1989. Other games released in 1989 include DuckTales, Golden
Good
Axe,
game.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the graphic adventure, Mega Man 2, Populous, SimCity, Super Mario Land, Strider, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game, and Tetris. What was your first encounter with Prince of Persia as a video game?
I don't know if I actually came across it when it came out. Someone put it on my Macintosh in 1994 and 1995. They had it, and it was, I guess, a cracked one or whatever. But at some point in 1995, over the summer, I taught an SAT intensive course up at Vail, where I stayed in the nicest hotel room I'll ever stay in because it's summer in Vail, no one's there, and they just put me in a room, and I kind of had nothing to do. So, it's nice out. I'd walk around, but basically, I recorded goofy things on my 4-track and finally played Prince of Persia and just hammered it for like 4 days. Save scum, but in the legitimate way where you can save basically at the beginning of each level. So you're trying to do it level at a time perfectly. And did finish it doing that. When I then played it for Cane and Rinse again, I did it as soon as I got over a spike, let's make a save state, another 48K on my hard drive. I think I'll be fine, et cetera, et cetera. And so because I did not have time to replay it for this podcast, but I did do a tour of my 100 save states and remember where various, moments are.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, I liked it a lot. It was not, again, I would say it would be definitely in the top 20% of the games totally outside of context in this class, but it really was reading Mechner's diaries and just getting this much information and this much context about it that essentially made me want to pick it on Cane and Rinse to corner myself into having to finish the whole thing again. Because when I started teaching in class, I played through the first few levels, but it's hard. And there's 160 other games on the syllabus, and and often I will use, like I did the same with the Fool's Errand, which I played through in college. Had always wanted to play through again, but
No, I get it. It is a game that there's a rich text to it, and you've talked about this before in terms of literally there being a very detailed diary, making it one of the most like chronicled games in its development of its time, which lends itself to a rich discussion like the one we're going to have. But it is also like this deeply influential game where you can see the skeleton of what will be the future of a lot of games in various genres, like not just in platform, but in adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not setting out to do that, but it is just like people seeing what this person is doing, what this game is doing, and wanting to iterate on that as games become more technically evolved. And it provides a template for that kind of thing. But we'll get into that conversation shortly. But first, we have to talk about how people are able to play this game in a segment that I do every episode called No Country for Old Games. Now, you talked about this a little bit, talking about how like one of the greatest struggles with your courses is finding ways for your students to actually access and play these formative seminal games of the 80s that you include in your curriculum. We need to talk about how readily available games are, because somebody interested in playing Prince of Persia, based off this discussion, would need to know how to play it. And the subject of video game preservation in general just means a great deal to me, because video games are an art form. It is something that is taught not just in like, here's how you make them in courses, but like, here's the value of them. Here is the cultural importance of them. Here is like the impact that these things leave behind. These create experiences that leave impacts on the people who play them, whether that is on an emotional level or on a creative inspiration level. But this means very little to publishers who have historically struggled with keeping older games available on modern hardware for whatever reason. And as time goes on, games that were once readily, easily available to purchase and play become more and more difficult to acquire. So in this segment, we're going to rate the availability of Prince of Persia on a scale of A to ARG. And ARG is me obviously expressing frustration how difficult it is to acquire and play a game, and is not me advocating for piracy covertly. That's illegal. To the dungeon with you. This is a very difficult game to discuss for a myriad of reasons on the preservation front, because it's on one hand a very easy game to access, and on the other hand, it is also a game that is not in the traditional channels of access. But we'll get to that in a second. The other reason this game is difficult to talk about from a preservation standpoint is because of the myriad of ports that were made of it. I'm not going to list every single one of them. Some of them are available on like Japanese only home computers. Some of them are UK only. And some of the American or worldwide computers this was released on in the early 90s include MS-DOS, Amiga, Atari ST, the Mac OS. The MS-DOS port is probably the one that people are most familiar with out of all the versions. This one was released in September of 1990, whereas the original was released in 1989. This is the version people are probably most familiar with, and if you have played a version of the original Prince of Persia, it would probably be this iteration. But in addition to the various computer ports, it was also ported to consoles, such as the TurboGrafx 16, the Game Boy, the Master System, the Super Nintendo, the Sega CD, the NES after the Super NES, the Game Gear, the Genesis, and the Game Boy Color. And these ports also have a wealth of differences. For example, the Super Nintendo version has not only enhanced graphics, but it also has 20 levels, whereas the original only has 12. If I had all the time in the world, I'd be happy to get really granular with this, but I didn't even have all the time in the world to play more than 2 versions of it. I checked out the Apple II version, and I've played and finished the MS-DOS version.
That is the correct path. In terms of, you got to touch the Apple II. I mean, I used to advocate for the Apple II with my students, but they hated it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, at the end of the semester, I'll have them rate for the purposes of future students to just kind of have a lay of the land, what other people thought. Because, every week, one of the homework is, you're playing a game from this list of 12 key games or whatever. You pick it, you write a response, people respond to each other's responses. But then at the end, I'm like, okay, I want you to rate these games from 1 to 10, but you do it in 2 parts, interesting and fun.
You thought it was funny.
I thought it was interesting.
Right? We're going to separate these 2 principles of just like, would you recommend it to someone who is studying this versus what do you recommend to your friend of like, hey, this is a good time? And a lot of the most fun games are not interesting, right?
Sure.
Probably ultimately my favorite game from this class is Space Taxi.
Mm-hmm.
Space Taxi is not, it's just good. It's like a lunar lander crazy taxi with hilarious voice stuff and a lot of different levels that have great gimmicks. And like, my presentation on it is about a quarter of the length of mine on Prince of Persia because I don't have a hell of a lot to say, but it's a smooth ride. Like I was saying about, Super Mario Brothers 3, we'd kind of figured out the lunar lander game by then. And we had not figured out the cinematic platformer with Prince of Persia, especially, again, the Apple II version, which is pushing so hard against the limits of that machine, where one hilarious thing about that game having a time limit, for instance, is it can't play music and have you move at the same time. So every time you defeat an enemy, you have to stand there as the little victory theme plays, and you're just like, come on, let me go. I would like to do stuff, but no. Trying to get the Apple II to make sound and animate at the same time is like incredibly complicated. And then again, like it gets ported so many times, and what's 2 games worth bringing up or maybe 3, because it really is worth looking at Prince of Persia, which is its own trunk of the tree in its own right, its own masterpiece, but as this amphibious form between like Loderunner and Castles of Dr. Creep, which are his kind of original inspirations, 2 Broderbund action puzzle games, non-violent, and Another World, Eric Chahi's, brilliant French game that, etc. And Chahi is highly inspired by Prince of Persia, but again, it is more bespoke. The locations feel like it does not feel like there's a level editor in some way. And he also programs it, I think, in like C or some way that is like, that's been ported to a million things, but it always kind of plays exactly the same because of the way he coded it.
Yeah.
On the other side, and this is again one of these things about computer games, there's 8 million different machines. They work wildly differently. If you make an action puzzle game like Loderunner, you don't want it to have to be too tightly tuned, right? One thing that kind of works about Loderunner is like, it's an action game, but it's more about figuring this stuff out and, not Twitch gaming, which means when you put it on a machine that doesn't have sprites or whatever, it survives. Prince of Persia, like Karateka, plays wildly differently. It's a totally different experience on the Apple II versus the DOS versus the Amiga's the fascinating one, where it is a 16-bit version that kind of looks like the DOS version, but is programmed by a friend of Mechner's who kind of keeps it sluggish, I think, in an attempt to like be authentic to it, and you do not want to play that one. The Mac one kind of feels like a Flash game. It's pretty good. And again, it's very snappy in the way the DOS one is relatively snappy, but still a cinematic platformer with that sense of like you can't cancel actions. You have to kind of hit the jump button a second before, etc., which is, off-putting.
And this isn't even to mention that there was a Gameloft developed a remake that came out in 2007 and was ported to various consoles and on mobile for a while. And it uses the graphical style introduced in the Ubisoft Sands of Time series, but uses the level design from that original 1989 version. And even that one is out of circulation. So you can't even play the Prince of Persia classic remake that was made in 2007, 18 years after the original, much less have an official release of the classic 1989 version. But this is where things get interesting, because the game, would you classify it as abandonware?
It might even be open source. I'm not 100% clear on that, but Mechner, again, has been very open with this stuff. I'm pretty sure the code is online on like his GitHub or whatever.
Right.
And there is a version of the MS-DOS version. Again, what's interesting is he didn't program the MS-DOS one. It does feel different, and it was definitely done by, but it is now kind of the canonical version because it is more fun. It is less interesting in a way, but it's definitely more playable.
Right. It's the one that paid his bills.
Yeah. Well, that and the Super Nintendo one, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe even that is always this fast. Again, the console versus computer thing, and one reason, these games are tougher to emulate, I'm sure, is just the scale is so different. The factoid I always bring up in class is just a quick Activision in 1982 releases Pitfall. That's their best-selling game. It sells 4 million copies. In 1984, their best-selling computer game, Ghostbusters, which is a huge hit that they're really happy about, sells 400,000. Right? It is literally just a one magnitude difference. And that doesn't really change until the 90s. So, the Nintendo Prince of Persia might have certainly outsold the Apple, might have outsold MS-DOS for all I know, even though it's not good and you should play it.
Yeah, there's the other thing about that is like it's kind of hard to track sales figures for a lot of even to this day, because it's kind of like self-reported, and like there was a short-lived Billboard's chart for video games, but that not become a universal standard by any stretch of the imagination. We kind of have to take it on a lot of people's words how much something actually sells, because that's very difficult to report, I suppose.
Yeah.
The thing is, right, and with the legacy of this thing, you're talking about the open source versions and all that, is the original publisher, Broderbund, is defunct. It no longer exists. So I can't really put this on, it's Broderbund's fault this game isn't really out there like that. I believe the actual intellectual property of Prince of Persia is owned by Ubisoft, considering that they are the ones that have published all subsequent versions of Prince of Persia after 1998. There was Prince of Persia 2, and Prince of Persia 3D that come out prior to all of that.
Yeah.
But after that, it's all the subsequent Prince of Persia games, starting with Sands of Time. That's Ubisoft. And like they do develop a classic remake in the Sands of Time style, but no, that's Gameloft that develops and publishes that. So I guess they licensed it out to them. Can we put this on Ubisoft? I'm not sure what to say. I don't know if technically the rights of OG Prince of Persia fall back to Mechner. And going back to Mechner, he, like you said, put a GitHub repository back in 2012. He establishes like a GitHub repository, and he puts the original Apple II source code on that repository, as well as documents about how that source code can be operated on. So he's made his original baby available to the general public in that way, which is a very altruistic thing to do as a creator. And that isn't the only official way you can play it. You don't have to resort, so to speak, to the Apple II version as the only way of playing this game to honor the creator. Like there is a JavaScript version that can be played directly in a web browser. And it wasn't developed by Mechner. This was a fan project. And you can play this on your computer or on your phone just by going to the website princejs.com. And there is an open source port of Prince of Persia that runs natively on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And it is based on a disassembly of the MS-DOS version. Uses simple direct media layer. It's called SDL Pop. And this is the version I would recommend to people who want to play the game, because it only takes up 2 megabytes on your computer. You download it, you open up the file, you click Prince exe, boom, open. It has quick save and quick load as a quality of life feature. This is the version I would recommend if people want to play Prince of Persia, and it's the MS-DOS version. like I said, 2 megabytes. It won't take anything on your computer. I played the MS-DOS version of the game originally using a variation of the MS-DOS emulator. Which one was it? It's not DOSBox. It was DOSBox X that I used because I wanted to create a bunch of save states and play around with that so I could get through the game. Frankly, I did not do all my research ahead of time, and I could have been playing the disassembly open source port that entire time had I known. But yeah, that's why I would recommend that. And like I said, other than Mechner putting his Apple II source code out there, these are all technically unofficial ports that were all uploaded by fans. There's also, and I want to just throw out this one too, you can play the game directly on the Internet Archive website. This is also the MS-DOS version. You won't be able to do save states, but you can stream the game directly on the Internet Archive. So this game is preserved on what is possibly the most important website in existence right now. It is readily available there. So I would consider this an official ARG in terms of like there are no active video game publishers putting this on like on the Xbox store, the PlayStation store, or on the Nintendo store or eShop or anything like that. But this game is very accessible if you have a computer or a phone in various ways that I've outlined here.
We need a term. It is to abandonware with
archived.
Yeah, it's got a free to good home sign. They're being well taken care of.
Yeah.
They're not abandoned, but they're, they smoke them if you got them.
It's a wayward game.
Yeah, I mean, because Mechner, I'm pretty sure, right, it's unofficial, but I think he did give his blessing. Like, it's not under the radar. It is just...
Ubisoft's not, like, writing checks for him to make this game out there.
No, and I think he has enough of the rights or enough say, whatever. It seems like he is in a good position where this does circumvent... Yeah, and archive.org is great for that. The main issue with playing games on archive.org, which is often, the first go-to, certainly for an action game, is saving, switching discs, etc. And that's why you then take the big sigh and are like, okay, I don't know. There was one year where the Atari 800 emulator, it worked on the Mac, but didn't have sound. It was just like, well, try to play the Commodore version, but worst comes to worst, you have to play this with whatever. That is, again, the reason that I don't think you can get a full 4-credit class out of anything if you analyze it deeply enough, but like getting Nintendo stuff to work, even if you're doing emulators, is just, there's much more slick infrastructure in place, I feel.
I don't do official ratings that I'm officially keeping track of at this time. We'll see what I can do about that moving forward. But I would scream into my microphone as the rating for this game because it is because I'm, if you take into account the various ports of the thing. Oh yeah.
The rest of them, they're hard.
If I could call this an A simply by the fact that the Apple II source code, the baby of the thing, is publicly available on GitHub from the creator himself. I could call this an ARG if I was like Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Amiga, whatever versions. They're gone. But like there are emulators and you can emulate these games, which again, that's falls to ARG territory.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And then like when you take into account like the open source version of the MS-DOS version, it's like a miracle. Hallelujah. I would just call this a nebulous sort of thing.
It depends on that. If you're gonna play 2, it's right. You're gonna focus on the MS-DOS and at least dabble with the Apple II to experience the raw primordial power of these non-sprite based 8-bit rotoscope figures jumping around like real people. Which is just kind of magical in a way that even MS-DOS doesn't have sprites, but there's something a little more, less primordial about it.
I'll let you rate it. You're the teacher. You teach.
Well, but the thing is you do want to look at the Super Nintendo version. It's very good in those additional levels, or like they're interesting. Mechner has been like, yeah, I should play through it sometime. Everyone says they're good, and these other versions that if you really want to look at this game, you should at least dabble with are. I mean, I was again very lucky to start teaching this class in 2016 and just grab a bunch of crap from the internet before things started clamping down. So people should feel free to contact me if I can help you locate something.
Yes.
That is an 80s American computer.
Right. Of course, the ideal thing would be anything we could have in a centralized, agreed upon place. That would be great. And the Internet Archive is a close thing to that. But like I said, it's not as much as I love it. And as much as I think this is legitimately the most important website presently in existence, It is imperfect both because of sabotage and also because of the nature of copyright and a lot of things. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't need that to be the load-bearing thing
Yeah.
on it for like preservation. We should have a version of like a digital library where you could officially play and have like accommodating save states and things like that. So people who want to do things under the guise of research or just because this is a culturally and historically important thing, have that be preserved. That would be the bare minimum thing. We don't need to like dedicate a whole episode to this, but this is kind of the perfect game to talk about this thing at length with because of why this is so much of an undertaking on a preservation level. It's like, I don't know if Blade Runner is the best comparison when it comes to Prince of Persia, but there is multiple cuts of Blade Runner, and we shouldn't burn all of them down just because Ridley Scott has a preferred cut and just because a theatrical cut is like almost objectively bad. We should be preserving all these iterations of it because that is a cultural conversation unto itself. And there's so much you can learn from the fact that Prince of Persia has as many ports as it does. And also we can learn a lot just from the fact that virtually all of them have been abandoned.
Yes. Again, it is a game that is more about tuning than some of the games it was based on, that those versions just are very viscerally different, even from casual observation. And probably the good news in terms of Prince of Persia very specifically is I would be shocked if Digital Eclipse does not do a making a Prince of Persia like they did with Karateka sometime in the next few years.
I love having more access to information out there, and Jordan Mechner in particular seems to be a person who's very obsessed with documentation, which is why I want to end this segment reading a couple paragraphs from this article published by Gene Park for, I believe it was the Washington Post, called Jordan Mechner versus the Sands of Time. And I'll link this article in the description of this episode as well. Most recently, this article was updated on April 3rd, 2024. So this is a very recent article. This is from the opening paragraphs to Jordan Mechner versus the Sands of Time. Francis Mechner remembers everything, including the time his family used watercolor paintings by Hitler to save their lives. He insists his son, Jordan, write it all down. Quote, I'm the only one left who remembers who these people and places were, end quote, the father says in 2015, pointing to a family portrait of Uncle Joji, who had bought the paintings years before Hitler rose to power. The paintings were presented to barter for visas out of Nazi-occupied Austria. Quote, a picture is meaningless without context, end quote. The scene is from a book about how history is often meaningless without context. Few understand this better than Jordan Mechner, who acknowledged his relatively privileged life in Replay, Memoir of an Uprooted Family, a new graphic memoir drawn and written by him. The book is the result of exhaustive daily journals kept by Mechner, his father, and grandfather. So part of like and this is me now ending reading this article, it's very clear that like the bones of like preserving something are like ingrained into the DNA of this family multi-generationally. They are documenters by design functionally. They're taught and trained to do this thing. And that's why I'm grateful that so much has been done to preserve this game in some capacity, and that there is so much writing by Jordan and his family to keep the history of their lives and their very interesting family history alive and available to the general public. So thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Francis. And thank you to everybody involved in the making of this wonderful game.
Yeah, and I think this is another reason to really emphasize this game if you're teaching about early computer games and, you know, both the wealth of material, but also the role model. If you're teaching game designers, I mean, I should practice what I preach. I'd go back and look at my old notes for games. I'm like, I have no idea what I meant. But the students I teach should regard themselves like Mechner did and, you know, write down what they're thinking, write down the movies they're watching. He has an incredible list of just like, here are the movies I watched this semester instead of getting good grades. And it's a fascinating, you know, array of influences. And you can really see where, you know, his secret sauce being having remarkable taste in a way and understanding that the 80s and certainly the Apple II for computer games is like the silent era for movies, right? The amount you can accomplish narratively is very limited, but if you pick your shots, you can achieve something that has kind of a numinous quality to it because of the primitiveness of it. Like Shadow Man, which is genuinely an eerie little figure, especially on the Apple II, which is literally just him realizing he can bit shift, because the way the Apple II handles color is bonkers because of, again, these technical limitations. Steve Wozniak is figuring out all sorts of fascinating ways to get around, but it is why if you look at Apple game in color and there's white text, it's usually got weird purple and blue dots.
Mhm.
So people should, right. They're in college and they're making games, they're doing stuff, write it down. Maybe 30 years from now, there'll be a digital Eclipse collection with it.
Sure. I mean, using a more contemporary example, Hideo Kojima
Oh, yeah.
makes journals of all of the games that he develops for, and they were published, but they were only available in Japanese for years. And there's people at Did You Know Gaming who are using translators to translate painstakingly all these diaries that he wrote for the development of his games, because they paint an amazing detailed portrait of what the production of this game was like behind the scenes, the mindset going into them, beyond the interviews of the people who worked on these games for years, beyond like official journalistic trades. This is like a very direct insight into the psychology of, one of the most acclaimed video game auteurs. There's a lot of intersection in Jordan Mechner and Hideo Kojima. And stuff like this, like keeping detailed journals and diaries, is just like one way we're able to get a more full understanding of some of the most formative art in the medium, which is true of all things. This is true of all things. No matter what you work on, people just keeping diaries just paints this, very illustrious picture and humanizes people who are often held up as titans.
Yeah.
I think that this is like fundamentally an important part to understand the human component of art. But, Prince of Persia is a game that's success kind of speaks for itself, although it only sold 7,000 units initially on the Apple II in its initial months of release. It would go on to sell over 2 million units by the time its sequel, Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, came out in 1993. But we're not here to reduce the legacy of this game to what it sold. We're not even here to reduce its legacy to its broader cultural impact, which we will talk about. But I want to sort of build this discussion around the impact this game had on somebody who played it and somebody who uses it as part of his curriculum. So let's get into that conversation, Jesse.
Need a new campaign idea for your tabletop role-playing game?
Looking to improve your GMing skills or become a better player?
Curious about exploring the origins of your favorite races, classes, and creatures?
Then check out the Maniculum podcast, where we show you how to use medieval history to your advantage. We're your hosts, Mac and Zoe, a professional medievalist and a AAA game developer, and together we use modern game design techniques to uncover the origins of your favorite tropes and adventures from medieval manuscripts. In each episode, we explore a new medieval manuscript, its connections to modern TTRPGs, and teach you how to adapt these tales into compelling campaigns and amazing adventures.
Whether you're looking to recreate the noble Arthurian tales or incorporate weird and wacky medieval monsters into your campaign, the Maniculum podcast has you covered.
Listen to our fortnightly podcast for free on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcasting app now.
Now, this is a game that, again, you have this academic history with. This is a game that I played for the very first time several days ago. I certainly have my thoughts about it, and we'll talk about those kinds of things, but I do sort of want to lead the conversation with your thoughts on the game in general. Specifically, what is it that you love about the game, and what does it have that you wish more video games would incorporate into their design?
It is an interesting question of how much of the love does come from an act of sympathetic imagination, right? That you encounter this game in 1989, which I did not.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously will hit differently. There's interesting quotes from reviews of the time being just like shocked you could accomplish this on an Apple II, et cetera, right? So, and that is something we talk about in the class about, like, there is a skill, I think, as a game designer to be able to put yourself in the shoes of someone and play something that is, older or janky or something, just because you can then feel yourself thinking through the design problems they were confronting or kind of looking at things right. But that's, again, a very academic. In terms of actually playing the game, I enjoy it a lot. Like, I would not, as I said, it is not the smoothest ride even on the MS-DOS version, because it is figuring out the cinematic platformer.
Sure.
It is figuring out how to incorporate real life human movement into predictable video game characters, which it is not really that's synergistic in certain ways, right? Like there's a tension there between people looking realistic and video game characters behaving in a predictable way that you can build skill around. You'll if you look at Karateka, like the health bars are incredibly long because the fights are all kind of stochastic slap fights, and like that's kind of how the game compensates for that, and that's fine. But the hitboxes are not tight. Yeah, I mean, going back to again, like if I had to pick a favorite game to, I had to replay any game just to do it, Dark Souls. I think a thing that really accomplishes is finding this midpoint between people moving like humans and humanoid, real people, whatever, in a way that has a juice to it that cartoon characters or just pure video game abstractions does not, yet still having them function in a very clockwork way that is very inhuman, but since it fits how the game works, does not put you off, right? Just the simple fact that all the enemies are just kind of standing there waiting for you to enter their radius, and then et cetera, fits the game in a way that squares that very difficult circle. How do you have the sort of thematic juice of things that look human, acting like people, moving like real things, but still have it be controllable and predictable? And that strikes me as the central issue that Prince of Persia is refining from Karateka, which is the first one where he does this rotoscoping in the sense of like taking video camera stuff and literally using whiteout on each frame. Very, very painstaking process. But it really, you can see why, even in his very early demos, there is, again, something like early Betty Boop or whatever, there's something genuinely magical about it.
Yeah.
I would say this is ultimately why I did play through the Apple II instead of the MS-DOS one, even though the MS-DOS one was smoother, was I wanted to kind of feel like watching an early animation can be kind of spooky or kind of put you in that liminal zone. There is something about the Apple II one that does that, and where you can just feel the struggle against, again, this incredibly primitive machine that this guy knows how to work like one of those one-man band things. And somehow I can just kind of really feel that, which is, again, like not the fun part of the game because it's more sluggish on that. You really have to get used to the delay and the way everything works. Again, the weird thing is insanely ambitious 8-bit game, nice tight little 16-bit game that is a reasonably smooth ride, although not as smooth as the console competition of the time, I don't think, from like Super Nintendo or whatever. I'm very interested in your thinking on it because, right, one thing that really does blow my mind about it is how minimalistic it is with its bespoke components, yet it still does not just feel like a bunch of mush, right? There are plot points, like he manages to have a plot with the bare minimum possible. And Mechner actually wrote an excellent essay, a design essay about Sands of Time, and really is kind of this avatar of that one direction of like, your story should be directed by the grain of video games. Like, what are they good at? They're not great at cuts, they're not great at long dialogue, Sands of Time is very, and that is one approach. It's not necessarily the right approach, but you can really see this in that. Jimmy Mayer, who does the website Digital Antiquarian, that I should shout out because an incredible source if you're interested in all this stuff, but wrote a very good essay called Prince of Persia, The Virtues of Restraint. But it's interesting seeing that restraint of like those minimal bespoke amounts translate into a 90s DOS game that could have been much more expansive, right? And essentially decided, I don't know, there's like one or two more skeletons because it can handle it, but is essentially the same game. But just in sense of that action adventure conversation with the player, the way items are placed, the little pranks it plays on you with the upside down potion or the poison or whatever, right? Again, very Soulsy in certain ways. Like there's definitely object placements in Dark Souls that make me laugh out loud once I understand the context, sort of mechanically what it means to put that there or whatever. And I feel like if you go through this game, again, I keep veering into academia. I do enjoy this game, but I enjoy it as like an 8 out of 10, right? I like it. It's fun. I'm happy to play it again. That is not the most compelling thing. It is sort of thinking about it as I am playing it and thinking about it, dealing with its constraints and how, again, when you're teaching this stuff as an intro thing, you're always looking for the exampliest example, right? Like, what is the best, Super Mario Brothers aside, it's kind of the, default. Like, what is the best World 1, Level 1 to show someone in terms of tutorializing level design, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What would you go to other than Super Mario Brothers 1?
I mean, other than Super Mario Brothers 1, I mean,
That's too easy. But right, I mean,
it
is incredibly good. Every intro class probably
yeah,
pulls it apart.
you think about it, like, I mean, like, like Donkey Kong. I don't know. It's like
Right.
it's a challenge to think of like a non-Nintendo example, especially when it comes to platform games.
Yeah.
And I think I'll approach the question in sort of this way, right? Because you mentioned a lot of things, like like Betty Boop cartoons, and the way that this game is created. I find this game to be an interesting exercise in creative limitation being put into an interactive space where the person playing the game is also experiencing a form of limitation in and of itself. And we can start with that in both the sense of like you have to experience a complete animation every
Mhm.
single time a character finishes performing an action. It's like you basically are forced to experience the fruit of this person's labor every single time your character completes a single movement. You're almost punished for it, but it is also just a core component of the game. And this person also laboriously put a lot of time into making that expression happen. And it's a miracle that it was put into a program at all. For example, if you begin a running animation, you have to see it through it after you stop holding the running button. You can't just like do a hard break like you can in a Sonic game or a Mario
Right.
game, for example. You can't do like a jumping backflip to sort of undo your mistake, but you can do careful steps. You can be very mindful about the moves that you make if you think about them for more than a second, which comes to the other point of limitation, which is the actual 1 hour time limit of the game.
Mhm.
There's this sense of urgency, but there's also this very strong sense of carefulness you have to do, because a risky jump could actually be detrimental to the point of costing you multiple minutes when you were trying to save mere seconds. So it's
Right.
this very interesting conflict of limitation. That's what's really drawing me about the game. There is like certainly this whole this whole artistic merit, this thing that becomes like this very important thing to understanding the language of video games, in the same way that watching early animated films or there's this really great Patrick H. Willems video that he made a few months ago about Muppet cinema and the painstaking process that Jim Henson basically did almost single-handedly, creating the medium of animatronics and Muppets and puppetry in the film medium as we understand it.
Mhm.
And that's certainly something that this game is making me think of on a micro level, because while, Jordan Mechner didn't invent rotoscope animation, certainly not, maybe wasn't even the first person to use rotoscoping in a video game, it is certainly an interesting thing where this person has just this genuine enthusiasm that he's drawing from, not just from like an enthusiasm of one thing in the case of Jim Henson puppetry, but also a genuine passion for cinema. In the case of Jim Henson loved puppetry, but his obsession with cinema was what drove him to improve his puppetry and to go bigger with it and to have greater creative ambitions into it. And in the case of Jordan Mechner, his love of cinema was what drove him to make this a sort of cinematic video game, not in the sense of like our post Metal Gear cutscene understanding of what cinema is in a video game, but as incorporating, like, I was watching this Errol Flynn fight, and I did rotoscope animation to emulate that in a video game. I was making this character move realistically in a way that creates a sense of danger and peril for the player
Right.
controlling him. That sense of, and that's a sense of understanding of the medium that is something that I really value when talking about the cinematic quality of something versus like our traditional understanding of the cinematic quality of something, air quotes. Not to say there's no time and place for all that stuff. Certainly things influenced by Prince of Persia, such as the Uncharted series, which I'll come back to that point later, are certainly using traditional inspirations of cinema on top of their influence from Prince of Persia. Yeah, no, I think of this game as just this really, really strong sense of like taking frustrations of limitation that the creator had and almost imprinting that on the player in a very effective way, while still making an entertaining game out of it.
Yeah, I think the time limit. I think a lot of games from this time have kind of built in the expectation that you will, to some extent, save scum. Like certainly the Infocom games, Deadline, which is kind of one of the first kind of clockwork games where you find out someone is going to make a phone call at 5:15, so then you go back to an earlier save and you make sure to be in the closet at 5:14 so you can overhear it kind of stuff, right? Jordan Mechner, his big magnum opus that he co-writes with Tommy Pierce, who we should get back to because she's an amazing person, who was a huge influence on this game. But that, you have like literally a watch that lets you rewind time, but it's kind of non-diegetic. It's much more of a, this is a computer game convention, but we're going to aestheticize the save scumming to some extent because it is this clockwork mystery, like Sexy Brutal would fall in that same category, or, other games where you're gonna keep going back. And I do think partly this game expects you to save at the beginning of each level, essentially. And then you have to execute, like, as I said, with the Mac version, where I couldn't really illegitimately save scum, I'd have to do the level perfectly. Because if I died, I might as well just restart it. It makes the combat especially tense because you can't do it defensively. Right. That the combat is a ticking clock. You have to more or less be on the offense, even though there is a parry that I did not know about when I played through it on the Mac. But when I finally read the instructions, there's many other useful things. But one of them is, if you press up, you do a parry. And if you can time that, it's very useful. But you've always got to be pressing ahead. You can't. There's often maximum health increasing potions that are like out of the way. And then if you get them, you have to go through all the jaw traps back or whatever. It becomes this there's stakes. A lot of these early games almost have too many stakes. Like Wizardry is one I'm kind of ambivalent about. Another recent Digital Eclipse remake where I don't care now. Whatever, right? But I think Prince of Persia does have, it's tough but doable.
Yeah. There's a certain modernity to it where it is certainly I hate doing this to an extent kind of feeling to it. Once I got a handle of the controls, I stopped screaming bullshit every couple minutes, but I still scream bullshit every about 10 minutes. And
yeah. Even on the MS-DOS version, I will sometimes just like just kill myself in a way. I'm like, you should have known I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
One tip for you probably picked this up, but yeah, if you hold down the jump while you're running, like you can hold it down well before you hit the cliff, and you will not prematurely jump. But it is like Uncharted, right? It is trying to manufacture, almost working backwards from the perfect moment, right? What's remarkable about Prince of Persia, certainly in 1989, even on Apple II, even compared to an Amiga, is Jordan Mechner's brother hanging there, like making the jump, hanging, and kind of you really see the effort in him pulling himself up in some way, even if it's a little 8-bit rotoscope. And he's kind of working backwards from that. The difference is Uncharted will cheat to give you that, right? And Mechner, we haven't figured that out yet, in some sense.
What's interesting is like, the Uncharted series and Prince of Persia are both series that are fundamentally trying to push the boundaries of the console that they were released on. The difference is Prince of Persia functionally invented the dangling off of a ledge and trying to climb up to the ledge as a mechanic. And then like there's just this like bigger sense of like scope and scale that Naughty Dog is able to do in a 3D space in those Uncharted games. So it's like you're playing in two different pools here. There's almost 20 years because it's 2007 is when the first Uncharted game comes out, and it's 89 when the first Prince of Persia game comes out. So there is certainly like beyond just the initial influence of like this is like kind of like going to create a sense of like realistic movement in a platform setting thing. Like there's just like this spirit to it that is influenced by but like Mechner is thinking in almost like pure game cinematic territory, what's possible in his thing, and then like the Amy Hennig and company and Naughty Dog are thinking this is what we have now with 3D space and movement, and there's obviously more than one game influence from Uncharted onto that, but it's building off
Tomb Raider is certainly in this lineage as well.
Tomb Raider is especially with the controls with this game, but there is like this really, even though this thing is influenced by it, like this in the spirit of it is purely the same. There is like also just different interests and ideas because what is possible are just completely different things.
Yeah, it's going back to, because we were talking about Super Mario and Super Mario 3 and sort of which is contemporaneous. It is almost like, this is a weird comparison, but help me. But like schools of cartooning with Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eisner being kind of these two fonts of like a realistic style versus a cartoony style, and kind of how they have different strengths and weaknesses, different relationships to reality. And I think that the movement in Super Mario Brothers is better than Prince of Persia in some sense of like, again, like an arcade game, you give it to a kid, they're going to get it pretty quick. It's in some way the first game that feels modern because there's like 12 different variables affecting its gravity in like a fine stew. And Miyamoto is tuning that, and I think, is a genius of that. But not that it is an easier job, but it is a cartoon character. Like a cartoon character should have that. Like the fantasy is there. You are controlling a cartoon character, and that makes sense. They can turn direction in midair. Maybe they can double jump, whatever. And you're playing off that. Whereas Dark Souls has a weird solution that I don't think imitators, whatever. But I think if you're trying, Arkham Asylum, I think does a very good job of finding that middle path of it being predictable enough that you can build skill at it, but it's still having the viscerality of feeling like people.
Yeah, there's certainly like, and that, the Batman's a great example of this because this is historically a character that's lived 1 foot in cartoon and 1 foot in reality. And what degree is cartoon and reality just varies from adaptation to adaptation.
Right.
How the Adam West shows are functionally live action cartoons, or how, the more recent Robert Pattinson film is also has like a heightened reality that's much closer in line to, say, the Arkham games, but is still like playing in like that's like gritty realism of behavior of human characteristics.
Yes, and human bodies can be injured. Right. I mean, this is an interesting one thing I realized being on the Star Raiders podcast is how much the default form of video games are like humans are built out of hit points, ships are built out of parts. If you make a game about humans where things break when they get hurt, it's Bushido Blade or it's Daisy or it's a survival, like there's a place for that, but it connotes a certain kind of like hardcore snowball, whereas all ship games are like FTL is kind of hardcore, but like all these games have this quality of like, well, your scanners are down, so you got to deal with that and blah, 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 because just thematically it's less upsetting or whatever, that there's that aspect to it, which again comes back to that tension of figuring out, how do you deal with things that have that grounding in reality, like the Batman or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's heightened, but it's heightened in a way that is not about like Wile E. Coyote bouncing back.
Yeah.
Right. That's a different heightened reality.
Yeah, and like this goes back to Prince of Persia in an interesting way because like it is rotoscoped animation with completely fictional, like you're not going to mistake this for reality, presentation. But there is also like a cartoonish sense of comedic timing every time you die because of how like abrupt and sudden and gruesome you see yourself get gored in half, or like there's every time you fall, there is like, which adds to the frustration, but like it is like you take a step back from it. It's like it is extremely funny every time you fall and then like scroll down 3 screens and you just hit a bottomless pit, or like not hit the bottom of like a fall pit and there's spikes in there anyway, which you wouldn't have survived.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's laughing at you and it's taking that comedic sensibility, and it's like it's the fact it's able to do that in its limited form at all is a genuine miracle, and it's something that I can still see modern games try and like Dark Souls is a game that like also like has a more less authored sense of comedic timing, but the game is doing its
when
best
it's
to
funny,
like,
it's often almost slapstick.
Yeah, it's exactly slapstick.
Or, I mean, honestly, the single greatest thing in all of Dark Souls to me is when the skeletons put themselves back together and then give themselves a little pat on the head to make sure it's attached correctly.
Yeah, there's like deliberate
pure
comedy.
Ray Harryhausen, right? That is just, again, harkening back to almost a silent movie comedy of, or John Wick, that I forget the name of the guy, but the guy who is the stunt director on The Crow, who is now probably the best action, or the stunt man on The Crow.
Chad Stileski, yeah.
Yes, right. And and there was a great interview with him where he was talking all about Buster Keaton and like just that sense of the timelessness of physicality, right?
Yeah. I would say like this game is the Buster Keaton watching like Sherlock Jr. of video games, whereas like you're playing Uncharted 4 and that's like watching Mission Impossible 7 when you're seeing Tom Cruise deliberately evoke silent film filmmaking, or like you said, John Wick 4. Deliberately evoked like this, like it's exactly that, like it's John Wick 4 versus Sherlock Jr. watching these things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Tom Cruise is a weird, sweet, generous one because part of the appeal there is that man might actually die.
Yeah.
Or what, like there is that odd element to that. Whereas But right, like that. I mean, that is the thing when you watch Buster Keaton. I have once used there's a narrative assignment in intermediate where you try to find kind of classic movies, have students try to translate them into video game pitch, computer game pitch documents, figure out a narrative. And one semester we did Buster Keaton because it seemed like an interesting, I don't know, have all the class do the same director as opposed to everyone doing their own thing. He went over quite well with the students because the way those things are shot is, again, working within its own limitations, like Mechner is at an even higher pitch of but also that man is really doing that.
Yeah.
And that is part of Prince of Persia is, okay, his brother wasn't actually hanging off of a thing 20 feet above spikes, but somehow the whiteout rotoscoped image of him carries through.
Mm-hmm. Like you watch the George Miller Mad Max movies and Furiosa, and you have this like, how did he do that? How did this production do that? And then you also watch the Buster Keaton movies, and like with the same tone and almost like same sense of wonder, but on a completely different scale, just go, how did he do that? How did this facilitate that? The conventions have changed. Obviously the safety standards have warped and moved. But the imagination has only been building off of these things. And there are certainly things that take more safe, approaches to art that don't really inspire that sense of how did they do that, but are perfectly legitimate works of art on their own. They're just achieving different things in spectacle or are just using the visual medium for whatever other thing. But like just going back to like these inflection points of like seeing like the Buster Keaton equivalent of this thing. And also seeing like how did they do that in the same tone because they are directly inspired by one another and respectful of like the history and the culture of the thing. That's what I'm really admiring about this experience. Like realizing I'm still having like this how did they do that feeling about something that is like objectively dated, and it's having the same like sort of tone I ask every time I play like this like very well thought out, meticulously planned game that's like riffing off of them.
Yeah, and I think that the tight level design helps with that. Again, the 12 levels. Loderunner is a great game, but it's got 150 levels, many of which were designed by like kids who lived into the neighborhood. And gave $20 because they wanted 150 levels. How else are you gonna do it? And it's a one-person game, right? And by the late 80s, that's starting to. I mentioned the Activision Ghostbusters game. That was one of the first games they actually had a team on because they had to get it out quickly. And a lot of the early multi-person teams are things like California games, where it's everyone does their mini game. There's a producer kind of putting it together with a menu or whatever. But like figuring out, like working in a team, it gets much messier. And, you were talking earlier about like Hideo Kojima documentaries, and the Bloodborne book is fantastic. But that is more like a movie where, a lot of it is about this kind of production, right? And that is, again, this is the tail end. A game that I think is less accessible, although certainly a very interesting game in its own way. And if people like RPGs, Ultima 5 is the other game, comes out in 88, originally on the Apple II. I think they have ports already going, but is, again, Lord British Richard Garriott. He knows the Apple II backwards and forwards. He's not moving on. And it's the last thing he ever programs himself. Like from then on, he is a producer, a designer, or whatever. But Ultima 5 is a bonkers, like it is kind of a clockwork game. All the NPCs have routines like in an MMO that works on a daily schedule that, you can interact with all these different objects. It is very morally gray compared to Ultima 4. It's kind of it is a fascinating one-man show. And Richard Garriott, not unlike Roberta Williams, very flawed game designer, but like you're getting kind of a direct line to their psyche in certain.
Yeah, like I deeply respect Roberta Williams, but like there were definitely somebody who's like brushing against the limitations of like the art form and everything like that. This goes to another point that I really like about this game is how early on in like the history of video games, it's like really good at depicting authored moments where there's only like one true solution to a puzzle. And I almost put this in the flaws section at the beginning because again, this is like in the first 2 levels of the game where I'm like, these controls are fucking bullshit. But then it's like, I came around on it as like, okay, there's one solution to this. It wants me to do the careful slide. It wants me to do this exact set of movements. And I do still consider how it's authored moments, which is almost functionally the entire game. There's like a correct set of ways of doing things with some level of exploration to make it feel less authored, which is a hand trick in and of itself. That's a very like illusory thing. It's very effortless and on a level, despite how effortful it is, which is the whole magic of video game design and editing in any form, is to make something that took so much effort feel effortless. It's a magic trick. It's this great thing because like these things have one specific solution. You have to do it the right way or you'll die and you'll face a time penalty unless you save scum, which I did. It's incredibly effective. And it is a part that's also like a frustration of the game, how like specific it is and why iterations on it are a lot more generous. Going back to your earlier point with like saying Uncharted, which is like trying to keep you safe as the illusion of danger is in front of you. Whereas this game's like, well, if you don't do it right, you don't get to beat my game.
Right.
Kind of thing. It's almost like two heavy extremes in another direction. An interesting middle ground is another game that I wouldn't even say this is a tangent because this developer Evil Empire, which is the co-developer of Dead Cells, Motion Twin are the main developers of Dead Cells, and Evil Empire have been helping with the DLC aspects of it. Evil Empire is also the developer of the very recent The Rogue Prince of Persia game that came out a couple weeks ago in early access. It is an incomplete experience, but if people want to play the most recent Prince of Persia, that's not the Lost Crown, which apparently is very good and I still need to check out. But these people have made a roguelike Prince of Persia game. And the thing I always think about with Dead Cells is Motion Twin made it deliberately. So if you made a jump, the game is very generous with their jumps. You know, like if you make a jump, like, and it's like, oh, you were like so close to grabbing that, we'll just give it to you. We'll just give it to you. The parkour and the acrobatics make you feel empowered, and the game itself is just super hard around that. So it's like that's the ideal middle ground to me of what this is. And Dead Cells is super in the spirit of the Prince of Persia as a general franchise. And I think that's why it makes sense that Evil Empire is like a really good choice as a developer for the Rogue Prince of Persia. I'm excited to see how that shapes up outside of early access. But that to me is like the ideal middle ground with that kind of thing versus like the two extremes of like super authored moment that where you're technically safe as long as you do kind of mostly everything right.
Right.
Versus like Jordan Mechner's like very early and again working with the limitations of what we had to at the time, like there's one solution, buddy. And if you don't do my solution, start over.
Yeah, and I think that was how a lot of games just were at that. But you want to give people value for money. Right. That is one of my rules of retro gaming is the more the reviews complain about it being too short, the more you want to give it a shot. Loom isn't the greatest game in the world, but it's pretty good. And you will play it in 3 hours and it will cost you $2, even if you buy it whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas you can see why people were upset buying that for $50, even though it was very impressive graphically, etc. There's a lot of these games have the classic Nintendo difficult, you know, the classic video game. Well, we don't want them just checking it out from Blockbuster for the weekend. There's all sorts of the Roberta Williams games are mind-bogglingly difficult and some of their puzzles, partly because the fun was spending 3 weeks at your Barney Miller desk job, like pondering what to do with the skeleton or whatever, and then having a eureka moment. And partly it was a lack of playtesting. Both Williams and Garriott, like Ultima 4 is technically unfinishable because there's a puzzle he forgot to include, like you'd have to throw a cheat because no one else ever play tested it, right? And one thing about Prince of Persia, where the long gestation period and him sort of, you know, going away for 6 months, coming back, etc., does really help it. And one big lesson of the 80s class tends to be the games that actually work best are not necessarily the most technically accomplished. They're often the ones that are created in social context where, like, soft porn adventure, which is the text adventure that Leisure Suit Larry is based on, is, you know, it is what it is. And it's from 1981, and I think it was written in BASIC, but it's a 2-word parser, etc. But as Digital Antiquarian writes very well about, it is remarkably playable because it was this dude every weekend showing it to his friends. It just kind of got worn into shape by actual human feedback and that kind of process that was not best practices with a lot of, you know, very good games otherwise.
Yeah. Which is a great time for me to, like, you know, get on my soapbox and say QA testing is a legitimate profession that should be protected as a job a lot more, and we should pay these people a lot more. Continue your point.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, but right, that Infocom's an interesting one where they're solo developers, but one reason they do well is they kind of all have an exoskeleton of, like, someone else is dealing with the ports, you have good QA, you have bug testers who are constantly bringing in, you know, reports of, I tried doing this, blah, blah, blah. You have people working on the intermediary language you're looking at, you're working on and adding things if you ask for it, etc. And that's why in that one-man show era, they're among the most successful. Whereas the other one, again, Archon, M.U.LE, these are 2 or 3 people teams who know each other incredibly well and are basically working like a rock band, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mechner, again, he never programs again, as far as I know. Last Express, which him and Tommy Pierce write and produce, is, his most, I don't know if you've ever played any of it. It is a remarkable, his most ambitious game, maybe his best game. It's hard to say, but totally flops for reasons that have to do with Broderbund. The 90s, one reason I've avoided the 90s is because it's all just a depressing, and then they were bought by the guy who's on Shark Tank and it all died.
Yeah.
And I don't understand any of it and I don't want to. Whereas the 80s, it's brutal and tooth and claw, but basically it's like, oh, we sold a bunch and we did good. We didn't sell things and that was bad.
Sands of Time, the 2003 revival of Prince of Persia. Mechner's very heavily involved in it. He's the writer.
Yeah.
He is credited as a designer, but he is not hard. Like, again, that's a crew. It has a different director. He's not programming the thing, but he's heavily involved with it. So I think you are correct that this is like the last game he is like really like, yeah.
Yeah, it's again this chess thing of like there is this magic to the 8-bit era of just like one person. Nasir Gabelli, who's one of John Romero's all-time heroes, is a very fascinating guy because he is a early, incredibly venerated Apple II game designer, but he's not really, like, his original designs were fine, but not remarkable. What he could do was take an arcade game and put it on the Apple II in 1980 in a snappy way, and he would literally program these things in like 3 weeks without notes, and like he couldn't go back and change them later. It was just like, it's in my head, blindfold chess. Here is sneakers, or what? Not sneakers, that's one. But yeah, right.
Right.
And yeah, it's an interesting, like, I have one Christmas vacation. I banged my head on assembly language and made a dot move, and I learned a lot, like just from the horrors of trying to do everything by just saying, take this number and put it here. Now take this number and put it here. Now just a zillion times, right?
Yeah.
And again, the kind of the sympathetic imagination being how powerful Mechner must have felt not having to do punch cards or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What was before, like, that's what drove these people, is now looking at doing it as torture, right? Even, Unity sucks, but you're not literally having to move every number yourself. But yeah, just again, that kind of imagining that primordial feeling, like the Betty Boop, like, we can make images move. I mean, I mentioned VR earlier, and yeah, I like the mini golf, which again is very, it keeps to its low poly aesthetic well. It figures out, they did a Labyrinth Jim Henson course, and it does a good translation of the Henson aesthetic into something inoffensive as opposed to like the meta house style.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's a magic for me to VR, like with early video games, which is like, light is moving on a screen. That is amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it'll wear off eventually, but that is kind of what I get looking back at Prince of Persia, is that oh my God, like, that's like a little person. And I'm controlling them.
This game made what we love about the medium possible at an early age. And a lot of these developers who are working at this time, Mechner is just an example of it. This is just like a very specific microcosm of like how incredible this era is because of what they're doing with so little, and how it foundationally lays the groundwork for the developers of the future. It gives them like inspiration. It gives them like a, how did you do that? And this guy's very open about his developing process. So that's also super helpful for people who iterate on that. This game is important because it inspires like games like Tomb Raider, which very consciously are like, well, we're not just going to adapt the fact that this is like a sort of adventure game in like a certain environment. We want to like sort of emulate the movement of that and make that part of like the tension of navigating around the space. And now we look at Tomb Raider as like something that's pretty aged around the edges, but is also trying to do a very deliberate thing in a space that is only so limited in what it's trying to do. It's not trying to intentionally torture you, but it is trying to work and create difficulty within that space and still try and create like something that feels like a legitimate adventure. And, some people will say like the Uncharted series is too authored, and it's riffing off of like, the authored sense of something like the 1989 Prince of Persia. And the kind of arc moves around to like, oh, now this stuff is too easy. And I like and respect all these games for various different reasons. And just because something's inspired by something doesn't mean it's perfect. Just because something is Prince of Persia doesn't mean it's perfect. But it is just important in the legacy and lineage of understanding something and trying to learn the lessons from other iterations on something riffing on this thing. It's just like really inspirational seeing Mechner's work be inspirational, if that makes sense. Because it's people seeing the beauty in something, even as, stuff moves on technologically and visually and graphically, and even in certain sensibilities. But like people still come back to these things to understand why it was appealing at the time, what we can learn from it, and how we can adapt that. Maybe we'll just add on to the wheel, or maybe we will just do something completely new with the wheel, like put a skeleton in there and make it a boss in Dark Souls. But we'll see. Yeah, no, this is a really wonderful thing I experienced, and I appreciate you putting it on my radar so I could talk about it with you on the show. Is there anything else you want to talk about pertaining to the game itself?
I never did really talk about Tommy Pierce, and I highly recommend Googling her and Jordan Mechner, and you'll read, sadly, she died of ALS in, I think, 2010, but she is a remarkably interesting person. There's more info in the graphic memoir to some extent, but she did educational software, worked with Broderbund, was kind of, advising, just a smart person who is not involved in games, but was just, again, kind of like Mechner, but maybe even more so, kind of a polymath with good instincts.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, her involvement in kind of figuring out that this game essentially lacked fiero, some sense of triumph as opposed to survival.
Mm-hmm.
One broad structural aspect to look at that I don't think I really talked about is Loderunner and Castles of Dr. Creep, in the games he was basing this on when it was first a puzzle game. You're really tiny, right? There's lots of levels on the screen that you can build kind of an intricate puzzle around. Prince of Persia has to be big for the rotoscoping to kind of impact, right? That it translates pretty well to the Game Boy, actually, because it's still only three, there's three levels on the screen. But if you're trying to make a game that is about puzzling things out and, not fighting people, but kind of doing spatially intricate stuff, like there's just a tension there, I think, that he was not able to resolve, and that, if you want to keep it at that scale, the solution is combat, right? The solution is combat and having it be more of a cinematic experience overall. We didn't mention, I think level 6 or 7, right? You fall, like, I forget exactly, you've played this more recently in its completion, but like, they're interesting, again. That didn't take much K, they're not big, but these interesting little narrative moments. The little white mouse that shows up. He talks in the graphic memoir about like Tommy Pierce, for like being like, you have to get that in there. Like you will find the 35 bytes to get this little mouse in, to just have the princess do something, right? Not be a completely passive character. And just looking at it, it is a remarkable achievement on Apple II, but because it has such strong bones, it translates into a nice, tight little game that doesn't necessarily seem ambitious in a weird way in the 16-bit era, but is just so, the level design, the spacing of the bespoke stuff. Again, he had a remarkable taste for a guy in his mid-20s in 1989.
It's a testament, and I think a big takeaway from a game like this is that you need to have a lot of varied interests if you want to make interesting art. You can't just be pulling from yourself entirely. You can't be Garth Marenghi. I've written more books than I've read about art. You have to really, and you shouldn't limit yourself to just your medium. I think some of the best games are drawing from things other than video games, but the things that make them stand out from like, oh, I watched a lot of movies and here are what movies feel like cinematically versus like I watched these specific kinds of stories and these are the stories that move me emotionally. And I like to bring that kind of heart and emotion into this thing. And you'll see reflections of that in the art that I make, or like I'll take an idea used in this sense and incorporate that into that kind of, what can I do to like create a moment like that in this new medium or different medium? It's thinking beyond like, that's cool, let's do it like that, versus like, that's cool, why do I like that? Why does it move me so much? Why is this part of me now? Why am I putting it into everything that I like? It's interrogation, and art is a reflection of the self in even the most rudimentary ways. In this game, you literally have to jump through a mirror to create a shadow self, and then the way that you beat that character is not by using combat as you expect to, but to put your sword away and then run back into your shadow self, who will also run back into you because he's a mirror image of you, and that makes you whole again. And there isn't really any deep thematic quality to that, because like the prince is this unnamed character whose arc is, I love the princess, I must save the princess so the princess doesn't die. But there is like that, just having something like that in the game makes it more narratively rich than if you didn't include a shadow self who you have to do like it and use an interesting mechanic to defeat that shadow self.
Yeah, no, and it's the silent movie thing of like, how do you get across these things when you can't have look, one remarkable thing I realized doing the Buster Keaton segment is how few title cards he has. Like he has like a fifth what all the other silent movie people has, because he's trying to convey it through motion.
Yeah.
The shadow self, I think when you read interviews with him, he kind of he figures out what it means to him later, but it really is just kind of Tommy Pierce poking him, being like, hey, can you make another character in this game? And him figuring out a technical trick, but then instantly realizing what you can do with that, right? That it would be like Keaton finding some weird thing you can do with the camera to make it look weird and being like, okay, what does that mean? How can I use that in a narrative to do X, Y, or Z? And yeah, I mean, one of the remarkable things about art is seeing that just preserved, that you can go back to backgammon and you look at where the pieces start on the board and you realize that, 3,000 years ago, all the pieces didn't started off the board. They come in slowly. And at some point, someone's like, the first third of this game kind of sucks and is boring. Where can I put these things to like get everything bashing into each other at once? And I know who that person was. But we still put them in the same sort of semi-arbitrary, confusing places now, because that's where that person or people in some folk way decided this is what's fun.
Yeah. And that's a testament to like why archiving and preserving things are important beyond just like we should be preserving video games. But like when something like that emerges, you want to see like, where did that come from? And then like someone be like, oh, I got it from this. And then you want to go and find that thing and suddenly it's not available. It's why we should be preserving games like Prince of Persia, because so many things take influence from it. And also why it's good that Jordan like wrote these diaries and kept them safe and presented them to the public so we could understand the intention behind these things and really get to like the heart of something. And I think that's what the big takeaway from this experience was for me, just like the heart of it and wanting to understand something on a deeper level that doesn't ask to be understood on a deeper level, but was felt on a deep level by a lot of people at the time.
Yeah. And his graphic memoir addresses a lot of that. So he's the full package. Good job, Jordan Mechner.
Yeah.
You're in our Hall of Champions.
Yeah. What's your experience with the other Prince of Persia games? What do you feel about them?
I played like the first 5 or 6 hours of the PS2 one when it was a PS3 download, and I enjoyed it. Don't remember it hugely well. I just replayed the first hour. It's very good. Like, I think, again, as a exemplar of the narrative is going to follow the grain of what action adventure games do well, I think it's a very strong game. The new one I bought a few weeks ago was on sale, and I was like, well, it is, Kismet. And I've played, I don't know, about 2 hours, and it's really fun. The action is very nicely done. It's kind of a 2D Souls-y Metroidvania, you could say, with generous parry windows, and it's a good, pleasant time. And certainly if there's anyone who deserves to riff off of that genre, it's Prince of Persia.
Yeah.
I have been thinking, if I didn't know this was a Prince of Persia game, would I guess that? And I am in this ambiguous zone of like, well, if someone told me, I'd be like, yeah, I can see it. But it's really lovely. I mean, it is, again, this kind of, we figured out the 2D platformer. And if you put this amount of artistry and care into it, like, yeah. And Mechner really apparently likes it. It is the game he talks about in the memoir that never happened was more of a AAA 3D open world thing. But at some point in that memoir, they're talking about it becoming more of a 2D linear thing. And he did mention in his talk at NYU that this game is kind of the ultimate result of all of that, development back in the day.
Yeah, that's something that I'm really curious to check out the rest of this series, specifically one, Lost Legacy, this new one, and also Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, the one that was released in 2003, especially the one in 2003, because people have been talking that up as like one of the great video games for decades, and I just never got around to that one. And it looks incredible. And Mechner was directly involved in that one. And the design philosophy of like modernizing something almost 15 years later, something that in its inception was influenced by 1930s movies, black and white silent films, maybe its most recent inspiration being like Indiana Jones, and using those sensibilities in like this 2D setting. And now that it's gone into this 3D sixth generation story, now that it's like they're deliberately evoking Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and The Matrix, which are the defining action films of the 21st century or late 20th century, and putting that into a video game and making that feel revolutionary for the time. That alone, just like those two design principles changing and evolving under the same franchise, is enough to like get me excited to engage with it. But the idea that there's like something even deeper experientially that have made people glom onto this is like, this is my conception of Prince of Persia, and this is like the gold standard of video games for me in general, makes me want to check that out. And I wish that was more abundantly available. I understand there's been a remake in hell development hell for years, but I'm fine if you just give me the original in some way, shape, or form. I would love to do that.
It's on Steam. You can, but then you're using keyboard. I'm playing it on Steam Deck, and it's fine, but it's a little awkward with the mouse control, whatever. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a PS2 game, and it is it's a smooth ride in the sense of, I'm sure a remake would be fine, but they've kind of figured out how to do that kind of parkour in a reasonable, again, a balance between press X for awesome and, hey, I just jumped to my death for no reason because, this is trying to be too much of a simulation. So yeah, I mean, if you can pick up that version, you'll have a good time with it, and you'll certainly see, right, that it's laser focused. And I think that is what appeals about that whole series. Prince of Persia 2 as well is quite good, partly because it's really Prince of Persia 1.5, as Mechner points out. He wrote a design diary, a document, like a long design document, wasn't really there. And as he says, this is usually a terrible way to make a game, but it actually turned out pretty good because there was so much I could have done with Prince of Persia if it was on a 16-bit machine, that you could really do just Prince of Persia Plus, right? You didn't have to reinvent the wheel. You're doing, okay, what kind of doodads and how much stuff would I have had if I had had this room to play? So
yeah,
I've, again, only played the first hour or two of that, but it's a nice design. And if you do enjoy that PC era, it's worth playing.
I had a good time with this. I'm willing to check out any game in this series, really. But that is Prince of Persia. Before I, end this episode, I like to make space for my guests to make recommendations for any kind of media, whether it's book, film, video game, music, what have you, based off of the discussion that we had today. So what would you recommend to people based off of our discussion of Prince of Persia?
I mentioned Jimmy Mayer's The Digital Antiquarian website, philfrey.net. I'm going to mention that again, because you can chart my course by what % of my course is just me finding slides fitting him. The CRPG Addict, are two incredible sources for, you're not going to play the thing, but you kind of want to know, you want to spend a half hour reading about it rather than. And in terms of other 80s games I'd recommend, a game I would like to shout out because absolutely no one cares about it, it's incredibly unimportant, other than Space Taxi, is Hex on the Amiga, which is a game from 1986 that came out on the Amiga from what is otherwise a MIDI music company, Mark of the Unicorn, and it feels like a good combo wombo post-Dominion iPad game that would have been an Indiecade at 2013, dropped into a time warp. And it just ended up in, I don't know how this person came up with it. It has a lot of fascinating, it's turn-based, but it feels weirdly post-Magic the Gathering in certain ways. And it's just a good time. And it's a game I've shown to students. I always try to have one game every week where it's like, you got a lot of work in other classes. Like, which of these games is just fun? And that's just my random, contemporaneous suggestion. The other one, I suppose, a lot of the students, very politically interesting game, Hidden Agenda on the Mac, where you are the head of a Latin American country that is essentially just getting squished in the tectonic plates of the superpowers. I have never survived as El Presidente. But that's probably the one that overall has gotten the highest ratings for my students on both fun and interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of another world. Look, Eric Chahi in general, again, I like VR, and Paper Beast is definitely one of the really auteur-y, this is a person with a vision. This is using VR in a way that is of genuine artistic merit. Even if you don't like VR, I think it would be one to, a friend with a PSVR 2 or a PC or whatever. Try Paper Beast. It's a remarkable game that is, using the medium, the French, Captain Blood, all of their odd, interesting games that will push the boundaries and are really thinking about this stuff from a different angle. Always interesting. And yeah, I don't know, watch some Buster Keaton. The High Sign is fun. Watch the shorts because they're like watching Sherlock Jr. is 45 minutes, right?
Yeah.
That is probably the perfect one in that sense of
Great starter one, yeah.
Yeah, it's a full movie, but it's kind of whereas a silent movie that's 70 or 80 minutes, the attention spans, but like the shorts are remarkable. So 1 week, The High Sign, Sherlock Jr. There you go.
There we go. Yeah, no, great recommendations. I want to start by giving a video game recommendation before giving my more weirdo recommendations. I've just started playing this really new game, actually. It's called M.U.LE, which is this game that came out this year. It is solo developed by Billy Basso, who has been working on this game for years, and it's been published by Big Mode, which is Video Game Donkey's publisher. This is the first game that they've published, and I am having a wonderful time with it. And it is clearly using, by his own admission, a lot of the video game design principles of computer games. I think he said like he was using a lot of flip screen, which is referring to rather than a side scrolling thing, you're on a single screen and then you try to get to the next screen. But he's using this in a more exploration style way where there's only really light exploration in Prince of Persia and it's a lot more authored. But I really think that this is a really good continuation of those design principles. He's also taking inspiration from Super Mario 2 and Super Mario 3. And I think he said that games like Fez, which was a really influential game in the early 2010s in the indie scene, to really like make this really good composite of something that feels extremely modern while also completely evoking deliberately limited graphical fidelity video games. This may be a lot of people's game of the year. I haven't played a lot of 2024 games yet, but I am delighted and tickled by this game already only being 2 hours in, and it is occupying my mind like the way that like these games were probably occupying people's minds as they were trying to like, how do I get over solve this one puzzle? Because this is a puzzle game. Fundamentally, it is an exploration game using puzzles as a way of getting around, which again feels like a tribute to that older style of a video game. So please, if you haven't already, check out M.U.LE. If you have a PlayStation Plus subscription at extra or higher, it's literally free. And it is very inexpensive if you want to get it on Switch or Windows. So please check this game out, M.U.LE.
Yeah, I've gotten maybe about as far as you. I got past some storks, so that's something. But yeah, it is a beautiful. What's interesting, if you go into the options and turn off the interpolated whatever the line scan, it doesn't look good, right? Like it really is a beautiful game because it is finding a way to aestheticize an old technical limitation of that kind of bright dim kind of palette. And yeah, it is gorgeous, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it. I also saw it on PS Plus and was delighted to see.
Yeah, so definitely check that out. I would also highly recommend people. Here are my weirder recommendations. The Internet Archive as just a general presence. It's always constantly in danger because of the pushback it's receiving against big corporations that view copyrighted materials of things that they're probably not even giving royalties to the people involved in. This is one of the most important websites in existence, as I've said before, and it's what makes this podcast possible because I'm not just using it to play older video games. I'm using it to use the Wayback Machine to read archived articles from websites that are now considered defunct or have been absorbed into other studios or have been absorbed by bigger companies, and those older web pages no longer exist. I'm using it to find written material on a lot of the subjects that I end up discussing on this show. It is super important for people, and it is just this, again, a critically important thing. Whether you are a music enthusiast, film, for example, To Live and Die in LA is a movie that you cannot stream anywhere. I own it physically, but it is a movie that you can't stream anywhere, but you can watch it on the Internet Archive. That's a very big deal. If you like bootleg music, concerts of, very specific performances that are usually lost to time until somebody uploads a bootleg video of it, that's critically important. Please, in addition to like utilizing this resource, please just consider throwing them a few dollars to keep the website up and running and support it as they are dealing with various like bad faith and litigious people who are trying to suppress knowledge and wide information from a general public. So that is my plea. And then lastly, another weirdo recommendation, rotoscope is the animation technique used in this game. There's many things that use rotoscoping to various effect. The Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings films use rotoscoping the amazing Adult Swim cartoon will use Smiling Friends will use rotoscoping in service of a gag. But if you just want to watch a series of movies that are fully animated with rotoscope animation, I would recommend the Richard Linklater series of films, Waking Life, Scanner Darkly. Scanner Darkly is my favorite of these, and Apollo 10.5, which was a recent Netflix release that was unfortunately buried and not well promoted.
I have never heard of. I enjoy both those other movies a lot. I like his use of rotoscoping, so I will check that out.
It feels like Apollo 10.5 was him. Like, I finally figured it out on an aesthetic level, and I really like it. I think A Scanner Darkly is the best of these three because it's a Philip K. Dick adaptation. It's using the rotoscope to really evoke an atmospheric effect of paranoia among these people in a way that it's like, am I in reality or am I not in reality? I think that's like the aesthetic and the theme like lining up with each other, but it also works to great effect in Waking Life because it's also dreamlike and it's evoking that dreamlike thing. Apollo 10.5 is about childhood nostalgia and the way that that's animated through the lens of a child. So there is a thematic there's a thematic purpose in all of these. But I would just really recommend watching all three of these movies if you are interested in rotoscope animation at all, to see how it evolves in an art format as he is using it in his films, and also just to enjoy three really good films.
Oh, yeah. I have nothing to add to that. I don't know. One more. Just a random, not recommending any particular tabletop games, but look up Oink. Oink games. They're from Japan. They're very small. They are of varying quality, but many of them are extremely good. I like Scout maybe the best, but they are, again, as an intro to game design teacher who's looking for those 20 to 40 minute things that hit an idea and get out. If you are looking to dabble in tabletop and you like stylish design and games that are like $20, look up Oink. See if they're right for you. There's also digital versions that are lovely and skeuomorphic in that kind of Nintendo tabletop way. So you can try them there.
Oink.
Oink.
Jesse, it was really wonderful having you on to talk about this really foundational game. I really appreciate you giving me so much of your time today. But before I let you go, please promote yourself. Where can people find you and what should they look up?
Well, should they find me? I'm on Blue Sky, Jesse.Fuchs. And feel free to contact me there. You can email me at nyujf126@NYU, and I'm happy to point people towards, again, I am technically an academic, even if I'm more of a goofy enthusiast teacher than like a serious, PhD guy. But I know what aisle most things are filed on. And I can help point them to you. You were talking about the archive earlier. I mean, God knows what % of my reading packets are from magazines that I have found on archive.org. So if there's anything you don't have access to or they don't have, or you just don't want to download, every issue of Computer Fun and Electronics yourself, feel free to beat me and I can probably, swing you a link or whatever. Besides that, as I was saying, the actual, ironically, my main focus this summer, once I'm done with my summer class, is the traditional card game website and getting a Discord going for that. So if you are a aficionado of traditional card games or are interested in designing your own or playtesting, okay, one more endorsement. Here's the biggest one of all. Dealer Smoke Break. It is a solitaire card game made by a great student of mine, FireX Haston, which is the one solitaire traditional deck card game that requires thought that you can play while standing in line. Does not require a table. You hold it in one hand. You're kind of flipping the cards from backwards to forward. It's brilliant. I recorded a video trying to explain it. You can look that up. But if that kind of thing sounds interesting to you, contact me. And when I get this Discord together, hopefully by the time this is up, love to have anyone who's interested in playing, teaching, designing, learning about traditional card games.
Thank you again, Jesse. It was really good to make this connection and have you on the show. It's great to get your perspective on here. It really means a lot that you did this. So thank you again for coming on. And thank you.
It was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Select and Start. Once again, I am your host, editor, and promoter, Keifer. If you enjoyed this episode, please give the show a positive review wherever you're listening to this, because engagement helps the show and your feedback will help improve it. If you want to get more engaged, give the show a follow on Twitter @SelectPodStart. If you have thoughts about Prince of Persia or any other games we've discussed, send a DM or leave a comment and I will gladly read it on the show. You can also support me on Patreon. If you pledge at least $1 a month, you will get early access to new episodes as well as extended versions of episodes such as this with exclusive content. That's on patreon.com/Keifer's Corner. You can find a link to that and a link to the rest of my projects in the description of this episode. Select and Start is on the Moonshot Network, which is supported by its own Patreon. Find out more on moonshotpods.com. The art for the show is made by my best friend Avery Ott. You can follow him on social media with the handle @AveryRobinOtt. That's AVRY Robin OTT. The show's theme song was composed by Mike Petrie. You can check out the links in the description for both of their works, as well as Jesse's here. All right, I think that's it. The tyrant Jafar lies dead, his power shattered. Throughout the land, the people of Persia hail their princess, and the brave youth who saved her from the forces of darkness. No longer a stranger, he shall from this day forth be known as Prince of Persia. Oink.
Oink.